All right, thank you. Very good morning to everyone. Before we enter into this business, I just want to let you know that what would be today's game plan. Yesterday, there are several items actually that are left over for today, and also there are several pending issues from yesterday's discussion. So the plan is that in the morning and after 2 agenda items already listed in the agenda, if we were able to squeeze the time, we would like to have a discussion on non-grant instrument, which is kind of kicked out from yesterday. So that is the morning plan. And in the afternoon, towards the end, and we would like to come back to you with several issues which are kind of pending. So that is the plan of the day, and this really requires everybody's collaboration for the effective and efficient and the business. So with that, I would like to ask that Abdul to start today's business. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Okay. Hello. Okay. Thank you, Madam Chair. Good morning, colleagues all. Just a quick reflection of yesterday's event. I want to say yesterday was very fruitful, and I would like to take this opportunity to commend council members for their inputs and for their full participation. I hope that will reflect on today's event also. With that said, I would like to strictly go to the agenda item number 10, which is the report of the STAR. I will kindly call on Ms. Rosina to go through the report. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. I think, as always, you expect me to start with a wonder of nature. And no, Gustavo and I did not collaborate on choosing primates for this particular meeting. But this extraordinary picture of a nursing mother is a red shank langur, or a duke, and it's from a young researcher, Bowie Van Tuan. So after the assembly, thanks to Tom Lovejoy, Bowie took Stapp to Monkey Mountain, just north of Da Nang, and he had checked the night before to figure out where the dukes were eating, because they always fall asleep in the tree they're eating in, and therefore he would know where to find them for us at 5 a.m. the next morning. You can imagine why this ape is often called the costumed ape, because of its really extraordinary appearance. So from its knees to its ankles, it has maroon stockings, it looks like, and it appears to actually have white forearm gloves, and then it's finished off with black feet and hands. There are only about 6,000 of these amazing animals left in the world, and 1,500 of them were right there in Son Tra. There's another 2 unrelated populations in Cambodia and Laos, but that's it for the world. And they're very critically endangered, living in a tiny strip of forest just above Da Nang. But for the benefit of those... Yeah. So for the benefit of those council members who were very skeptical about that ammonite striped rabbit I showed you in my presentation at Assembly, this truly is a real picture. It's an amazing rabbit that was discovered in the mountains bordering Laos and Vietnam. So I just want to say both these pictures are real and not photoshopped. So scientists do not Photoshop. Some other primates. Here is Stapp. And we are really happy to welcome 4 new members simultaneously to our team. And they're standing against the wall, and I'll call them out by name, and I hope you will see them rotating through our chairs throughout the day and talk to them at the breaks. So first we have Salim Ali, who is doing climate change mitigation. We have Rosie Cooney, who is doing biodiversity. We have Jamidu Katima, who is not here because he couldn't get his visa from Tanzania in time, but he's our chemical and waste management person. Graciela Mitternacht, who's a land degradation person, and Mark Stafford Smith as an advisor to the chair. They continue to work with Blake Ratner, who's our international waters, and Ferenc Toth, climate adaptation. And of course, in the chair, Tom Lovejoy, former Stapp chair, continues as a senior advisor. So we have a full complement of experts who are both deep in their focal areas and broad and systems thinkers interested in integration and transformation and ever so eager to help with the impact programs. So again, I hope that you will meet them in the breaks and throughout the rest of the meeting. So today I'd like to talk about three different things: a little bit on new science, an update on STAT papers, and then forward thinking towards the impact programs and future work, because Council made it clear they would actually really like to know what we're thinking about doing before we decide to do it, and perhaps comment on it. So first, a little bit on new science. The CEO referenced yesterday some of the new reports on climate change, including the recent report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change on 1.5 degrees Celsius. And I just wanted to recap a few of the key findings of that. First, it would be hard for you not to have heard about it since it received very wide press coverage. But global temperatures are likely to reach that 1.5 degrees Celsius temperature above pre-industrial between 2030 and 2052. And so I think that number 2030 really focused the mind. And you saw a lot of press around, my goodness, we have a tagline of 12 years to act. It's quite clear from the report that the risks for both natural and human systems will be worse than today, and we're already seeing some impacts today when we hit 1.5, but they'll, of course, be even worse at 2 degrees. And so the report argues that limiting temperature increases to 1.5 will lower impacts on terrestrial ecosystems, freshwater ecosystems, coastal ecosystems, and they will then in turn retain more of their services to human. And a very important point that I think has been coming up several times in our discussions so far at the Council meeting is adaptation, and that the adaptation needs will be lower if we can limit temperature increases to 1.5 degrees as opposed to 2. There are a lot of adaptation options that can reduce the risk of climate change, but the faster and the higher the temperatures increase, the less effective adaptation measures will be. There have been some interesting ways to try to compare the difference between impacts at 1.5 and at 2 degrees Celsius. And so on the left, you see the impact. The middle is what the increase would be at 1.5, then at 2. And the summary column on the right, how much different the 1.5 to 2 is. And so you can see that 2 degrees, more than double human populations will be exposed to extreme heat as in the 1.5 degree case. You can see there will be an increase in ice-free Arctic summers, and there I show you a picture of a polar bear that actually found a portion of solid ice off of East Greenland to settle on. Then you see in the next three a doubling or a tripling of the possible losses of vertebrates, plants, and insects. And so on the right, I show you a male poison frog. And we know frogs are stressed by habitat degradation and disease and now climate change. But I want you to note that this frog is transporting a tadpole on its back to a pool of water so it can survive. An example of male parenting among frogs. Some more examples of the difference between 1.5 and 2 degrees. The area of ecosystems that will be shifting towards the poles will almost double between 1.5 and 2 degrees. More permafrost will thaw. So the guess is that at about 1.5 degrees increase, the area of permafrost thaw will be about half the size of China, but at 2 degrees it'll be half the size of Antarctica, just to give you an example. Crop losses will increase, and here is the statistic for maize in the tropics. Coral reefs will be essentially gone at 1.5, let alone 2, and that coral picture on the right is from Lizard Island off of Australia, and that reef went from the picture on the right to the picture on the left between March and May in 2016. So meaning either 1.5 or 2 will require unprecedented transformation across all economies, industries, and geographies. But success offers the reward of more secure communities, ecosystems, and economies. And just to show you the emissions pathway that would be required to get to 1.5 degrees, you can see that the world is now at about 40 billion tons of CO2 a year, and then really can't grow at all, and depending on which of those pathways you're on, still need to drop like a stone and essentially have zero emissions by mid-century. A rate of change that is astounding and unprecedented. Another very new report that just came out last week is the Arctic Report Card, and it came out at the American Geophysical Union, and it reiterated some of the things that we knew before, the speed of melting ice and thawing permafrost, but also begins to identify the complexity of those physical impacts on the ecosystem. So the rate of warming in the Arctic is twice that of the rest of the globe. We see this continued loss of ice, snow, Greenland melt. But now we're beginning to document some of the impacts. So a 50% loss in caribou and reindeer. Warming oceans in the Arctic are producing toxic algal blooms, which are affecting the food sources there. And plastics, yes, they're everywhere. And one new study suggests that the long-term concentration of marine microplastics are higher in the Arctic basin than in all other ocean basins. So it's depending on how it gets there and stays there and gets incorporated into the ice. So anyway, things at the poles are very difficult and changing quickly. They're so worrisome that local wildlife have offered to help. And this female southern elephant seal is one of a squad of 14 sensory-equipped seals living off the coast of West Antarctica. And these 14 seals have already produced 10,000 observations in 9 months of temperature and salinity in the Amundsen Sea, which is a really remote and understudied patch of ocean where the melting of the West Antarctic ice sheet could be detected and help us predict changes. But 10,000 observations is 5 times the number we got in 20 years of ships, because the ships can't take much data in the frozen Arctic Ocean. So these seals have covered 150,000 square kilometers, even though they're very harsh winters. But all of the new climate data suggests that the changes are serious, already underway, and that adaptation is definitely needed, and I would argue woefully under-attended to. But this may be the year of adaptation, and I just wanted to mention that the new Global Adaptation Commission has been formed, led by former UN Secretary Ban Ki-moon, Bill Gates, and Kristalina Georgiev, the World Bank CEO. Naoko is a commissioner, and I have been appointed as a science advisor. We owe a report in 1 year, and that will include why adapting to the risks is essential, what actions are needed, how we can start, and really engage stakeholders and research partners in action themes. There's actually going to be 6 action tracks that will continue the year after this report comes out, very relevant to what we're talking about here at the GEF. One on food and rural livelihoods, one on cities, one on global supply chains, one on finance, one on social protection, and one on nature-based solutions. So a lot of synergy here. And I think, as many of you know, the World Bank just released its own adaptation and resilience plan, which intends to ramp up adaptation funding to about $10 billion a year. So very important time. And I think adaptation is finally getting the attention that it has long deserved broadly. You know from my previous presentations to Council that we care a lot about climate screening, and we were asked by the Council to look at the effects of climate change on GEF projects and programs. So we're in kind of the 3rd phase of that now. So just to remind you, in the first phase, we looked at GEF 5 and GEF 6 PIFs and PRODOCs. And while climate information is increasingly available generally, it's not really being used adequately in the assessment of climate risks in PIFs and PRODOCs as we looked at GEF 5 and 6. We're actually not sure if the project designers don't know where to go. When it was used, the climate information was often cursory, and while they mentioned a list of impacts sometimes, did not include a plan for their amelioration, and sometimes when they talk about climate change, they would say, and over the 5 years of this project, so thinking only about project implementation, not the lifetime of what it is that the project is putting in place and the expected environmental benefits over a long time frame. And then we also found that risk analyses were often done too late after the development of the project objectives. Phase 2 was an analysis a deeper look at the GEF 6 projects in that original database, where we applied 2 existing and pretty well-developed screening tools, one by the World Bank and one by the Agency for International Development. And I actually gave a 30-minute presentation on this analysis at the STAT meeting in Da Nang. The analysis indicated that there are some strong projects which do really clearly state climate risks already in the PIF and define objectives to address climate change, which often then you would find further explained in the PRODOC down the road. But there were, again, many others where there simply wasn't enough climate information to do a proper risk assessment or apply a screening tool. So taking the results of these 2, we're now in a phase 3 where we're looking at the agency approaches to climate screening. So with the help of a graduate student who is part of phase 2, Marcy Kim, who I think is also against the wall or waving to us somewhere, we are interviewing and getting information from all of the GEF agencies on how they undertake climate risk assessment. We're not done, but a preliminary analysis suggests of the 18 agencies, 2/3 are doing something. About 6 of them are doing something pretty seriously, 6 of them are doing something pretty cursorily, and the other 6 we don't have enough information to know yet. But we hope to continue to get more information and perhaps hold a convening with the agencies to refine ideas on screening. And we are working with the GEF Safeguards team, of course, and Council seemed to welcome the climate risk screening in the safeguard policy yesterday. And indeed, we do think this kind of screening needs to start at the PIF stage and then can be further developed and refined by the PRODOC stage. So based on all of this, in August, just after the June Council meeting, we put up our clarified and codified guidelines because we had been asked by agencies, what is STAP looking for as we fill out the PIF? And so what does STAP look for when it screens projects? We're hoping that the improved database system, when agencies enter their PIFs, they can click on what is STAP looking for in climate change, and it will say these 4 things. How will it be affected by climate risks? Not just the 5-year period, but over a longer period, and have you addressed them? Has the sensitivity to climate change and impacts been assessed? Do you have measures to address risk? How are you going to deal with it? And what information do you need? And so we're asking for this at the PIF stage and hoping that it will be spelled out more by the PRODOC stage. In truth, we really wanted to actually include a table that gave the agencies an idea of some of the things they should think about, kind of a checklist. Is this in an area where sea level rise is an issue? Is it increasing drought or whatever? But we backed up to these 4 for starters. And as I said, we'll continue to work with the Safeguards group and look to see what the rest of the agencies are. And we hope to come back with some finer grained information at the next council meeting. So let me just quickly talk a bit about the updated papers. I talked about novel entities in its mid-stage in Da Nang. Once again, novel entities are things that humans make and introduce into the environment that can be synthetic chemicals or radioactive materials or nanoparticles or these microplastics. But they can also be modified life forms like synthetic biology and gene modification. And boy, a lot is happening in this world, and especially in the last few weeks, we've been seeing a lot about novel entities. So these can deliver environmental benefits, but they can also become major environmental problems, and you just need to think back to DDT or chlorofluorocarbons or PCBs. So GEF needs to be aware of these and strategically consider what role it can play as they become the reality of our world. So we identified these novel entities as relevant to the work of the GEF, and I just want to say a few words about 4 of these. The first one, technology critical elements. This includes the platinum group elements and rare earths and other scarce metals that we use in a lot of emerging technologies and green technologies, but they can have harmful effects on plants, ecosystems, and human health when they're released. So this is an artificial lake called World Tech Waste Lake that was created as a result of the mining and processing of rare earth elements used to make electronic gadgets and wind turbines and electric cars. But this was formerly a farmland. And so the mining can lead to a lot of soil removal to contaminated wastewater and then the mine tailings getting into streams and lakes. But rare earth mining can also be a significant source of radioactive contamination, as this headline shows. And then given the imbalance in the supply and the demand of rare earths, several countries and corporations are thinking about mining the rare earths in the deep sea. But we know very little about the impacts of this on ocean floor and on ocean ecology. And if you look at where the extraction of these components is taking place, a lot of it is in developing countries, and so of GEF concern, including, I would say, in Africa and South America, because these areas are expected to increase in their mining as supplies elsewhere dwindle. We also are concerned about blockchain technology. It has many interesting applications to monitor things like chemicals and waste or energy microgrids or reducing illegal fishing. But here's one innovative use that I thought was particularly interesting to bring to your attention. It's being used for conservation efforts in Madagascar at the Renoma Fauna National Park. So here, it provides pictures and GPS coordinates every time a tree sapling is planted, and then compares that with satellite imagery or light readings from ground sensors to confirm whether or not there's an increase of trees in that area. So people can donate and receive real-time updates, and something like this is actually being considered as a possibility for impact investing. That is, planting trees with the intention to generate positive, measurable, and environmental impacts, but maybe get a financial return too. Gene editing has been in the news an awful lot, and I'm not going to talk about the babies, but it can be also used to improve the ability of plants to adapt to climate change or to drought or to increase their productivity, but it can also be a threat to biodiversity. And these things have, of course, been talked about at great length, including the recent CBD Conference of Parties, and there was agreement to apply a precautionary approach and only consider introducing organisms containing engineered gene drives into the environment when scientifically sound, case-by-case risk assessments have been carried out. But gene-edited foods, such as canola oil, already exist. There are also efforts to boost the cacao plant's immune system to viruses so that chocolate, a key food group to many of us, continues to flourish, and to improve the ability of a native variety of corn to produce more grain under drought condition. And researchers have also successfully used this CRISPR gene editing to create malaria-resistant mosquitoes. So that could help reduce disease transmission in humans, could also have broader impacts on the environment. Cellular agriculture, also in the news this week, is an emerging technology for producing meat from cell cultures without the animal. In fact, the first effort to produce meat was only from cells was in 2011, and it cost a whopping $325,000 for that first burger, which dropped to $11 in 2015. And the cost is now projected to decrease to less than $5 a pound by 2020. So it could be 2 councils from now, we'll find it in the World Bank cafeteria. So when you think about something like this, cellular agriculture could help to achieve a more sustainable food system, and it could significantly reduce the environmental impacts of the current food system. Benefits such as mitigating climate change, protecting biodiversity, reducing degradation of land, forests, and international water, and reducing chemicals and waste, because livestock production is responsible for a lot of waste. And that's really important as we try to think about global demand to feed a world of 9 billion people. but it is going to change the livelihoods of many of the people that the GEF thinks about. So I think this is another issue we need to keep on our horizon. Another paper that's finally finished and posted was one on innovation and the GEF. And of course, the GEF was meant to be innovated from the outset in its design, its government, its operation, and its initial pilot projects. And it's clear the incentives for greater innovation to increase effectiveness, economic efficiency, longevity of results, and that true transformational change that has become part of our mantra. There are many examples of innovation in the GEF, from the technology transfer centers, its experience with the non-grant instruments, pay-as-you-go for solar lamps, policies to support climate-smart planning, strengthening capacity for transforming markets. And so looking forward, the staff paper makes recommendations for innovation in technology, including some of the things I already mentioned, like the circular economy or novel entities, but also in other 4 domains, thinking a bit about finance, business models, policies, and institutions. But what I really wanted to highlight today is staff's cross-cutting recommendations to bring to your attention to boost innovation. So one of the things that we think will be important to think about is risk. So innovation brings with it the possibility of less good outcomes or even failures, and falling back on trusted and true solutions, which have been proven to work as a safe option, but it might not deliver transformational change. And so it could even be that the enemy of innovation is a solution that works okay. The IEO in OPS 6 reported that about 80% of the projects were rated as satisfactory, and then the council raised questions about, well, what about the other 20%? But you might also ask, are we taking enough risk? At some point, expectations of very high rates of success and an intolerance of failure could result in very conservative goal setting, which is a disincentive to innovation. So staff thinks it's important to question and assess the strategic level that would be desirable and acceptable of risk in different areas of the GEF investment portfolio. I mean, it could involve setting targets for success while thinking some innovations will fail. So understanding the GEF's appetite for risk is important. A second item that came up is it's not really clear who's responsible for innovation in the GEF. Everybody is, right? Innovation comes from the Secretariat, from the agencies, from staff, from IEO, from the private sector, from academia, from non-governmental organizations. And while the project proponents are explicitly asked about innovation in the PIF, the extent to which this question is addressed or how seriously it's taken varies greatly. And so requiring a better explanation of what is new in a proposed project might encourage the proponents to consider innovation more seriously. Third, we think it's important to cultivate innovation in design. So a more rigorous explanation that the innovative elements in the design are defined and evaluated might be important and help us identify what you could call maybe big bets, possibly high risk, but possibly high payoff. And then, of course, encourage adaptive implementation and exchange lessons. So this lasting impact obviously requires time and persistence and adaptation and learning from failure. And you can't see all the opportunities for innovation at the design stage. So the proponents need to demonstrate how they are identifying obstacles and opportunities during the course of implementation and share them. Another paper we are continuing to work on is local commons for global benefits. And the idea for this paper started back, Naoko, at the Global Commons Conference in October 2016, after a lively discussion about how best to manage the global commons, top down or bottom up. Of course, there's no single answer. The problems are complex and require different approaches. But it did help focus us on the very important role of stakeholders, including indigenous people and communities. And in forests and drylands, poverty is widespread and people are heavily dependent on the natural resource base. And that's also where you tend to find weak institutions and the rights to land and natural resources lost. You know that forests cover 30% of the planet, but have 90% of the biodiversity, and they store a lot of carbon. And drylands hold many endemic species, that is, the species that are only found there, and include probably about 20% of the major centers of global plant diversity. So the local commons aspects are really important, and I just wanted to point out that a recent evaluation of the small grants program by the IEO found that attention paid to local community level benefits and livelihoods, poverty reduction, and gender issues had yielded impressive results. And this picture was taken on Chom Island, where a GEF small grants program provided funding to train local communities on conservation and on the endangered crab, which is known locally as kuada. And the activities it included were things like developing plans and regulations for management of the crabs, a group of guards and catchers of the crabs, rules for community-based monitoring and harvesting, and labeling and certification. So here you can see one of the skilled measurers and labelers certifying the crab size, making it eligible for sale. Kind of looks like a familiar face.
I have a seal here.
Yes, that indeed is Naoko. There is no one-size-fits-all approach, but there are a number of underlying considerations which can improve the likelihood of success for community-based natural resource management, including maximizing the value of wild resources, such as these crabs, and their ecosystem services, inclusive community governance, adaptive management and learning, encouraging secure tenure and community ownership. So a final version of this paper will be posted probably within a month. Now, just looking forward to the impact programs. You all know that STAP's paper on integration for the Assembly had 7 recommendations. You probably have them all memorized by now. And I don't need to read them to you, but I would just say exemplary stakeholder engagement was one where with the local communities, not just government officials, and since then we found out, there's not actually a whole lot of literature on stakeholder engagement for regional impact. And as we move to the IPs, I think this is going to become more important, and that's one area that STAP would like to consider addressing in our future work program. So the issues of integration, which evolved as we all thought about what worked for MFAs, for the IAPs, and now the IPs, are things that I think are going to be very important to include. Then there was a very interesting meeting of the agencies who had run the IAPs, and they shared with us some of their lessons. This was held in October. And some of their messages kind of are synchronous with what we've been hearing. You need a really good program document up front to help countries design projects that will be in line with good practice on integration. The coordination takes time and money and has to be part of the process and planned for ahead of time. There might be high upfront transaction costs in getting agencies to work together, but they will pay off. And identify a wider range of options. Building trust is key, but that also takes time, but then it helps with integration and scaling, and that this close and continuing engagement with stakeholders, whether it's formal or informal, and preferably kind of both, is important for facilitating dialogue and building trust. So STAP and the IPs, we will have some principles for integration that you have just seen as we think about the IPs and reflections from these agencies. We will have a formal role in reviewing the IP program documents, which you heard will be submitted at the June Council next year. And we stand ready to assist in developing the IPs where we can add value. For example, I would think perhaps on systems thinking, theory of change, resilience, adaptive management, knowledge management, stakeholder engagement, and climate risk screening. And we could also consider the IPs on whether the interventions appear to be catalytic or innovative or transformational and scalable. We will assign a STAP panel member to each of the IPs, and we've already been exploring with the lead agencies and GEF secretary how best to do that. So in addition to climate screening, which I've already talked about, there are a number of other items in our potential work program that could help with the IPs that we're thinking about. And again, Council asked to hear about them early, so here are our nascent thoughts. One is more work on use of Earth observation data to improve program and project planning. The IEO report of 2015 noted that recommended using geospatial technology to more effectively monitor GEF interventions. And then a GEF report in 2016 on biodiversity mainstreaming concluded that modest and targeted investments in spatial and land use planning can be quite impactful. And so we are considering an advisory document that would help guide practitioners to incorporate Earth observations and other spatial data into the development and implementation of programs and projects. Obviously, we would collaborate closely with the GEF agencies and with the IEO on this. We've done a lot of work, as you know, with Annette Cowie, the previous STAP land degradation member, on land degradation neutrality. And now, under the Convention to Combat Desertification, over 100 countries are setting targets to achieve land degradation neutrality. And GEF 7 is assisting countries with its implementation. So STAP will develop guidelines which will focus on how to enable effective implementation of LDN. For example, identifying drivers of land degradation and then practical steps to make action transformational. And again, this will build on the considerable work that STAP had already done leading up to the LDN agreement. Given the importance of adaptation that I mentioned, we are considering working with the science community and the Global Adaptation Commission to develop possibly adaptation metrics that we might be able to consider in GEF projects and not just in the LDCF and SECF projects. I already mentioned that the science of multi-stakeholder engagement is not that well formed, but we are proposing that we might develop a paper to answer 3 questions. So what is the evidence regarding the role of multi-stakeholder dialogue in influencing transformation in socio-ecological systems? What lessons can be derived from past experiences? And what implications does this have for GEF programming? And as I said earlier, how this can be effective in regional settings as opposed to community or country settings is a particular angle we might want to look at. We might also want to look at the broader environmental benefits of the chemicals and waste projects. As we heard from Francoise yesterday, there's often Did my microphone go off? Oh, I'm back. and then this last area is aquaculture, an area that's increasingly important and kind of confounding as we seek to feed 9 billion people in a changing climate with changing ocean conditions and plastics. Okay, so that's just some thoughts. Happy to talk about those more. I want to end where I began, which was in Da Nang at the assembly. In this little strip of green that you see is where 20% of the world's remaining red-shanked langurs live, this tiny strip of forest over the city. Council, you have told me you really like it when you can take home stories from Council to your children, and like you really like the spider Gryffindor, and I showed that I think 2 councils ago, so those of your children who are into Harry Potter really like that. So let me end with something that I hope will maybe entice your younger relatives, and something that this reminded me of in Da Nang. And so for those of you who have children of the appropriate age for Dr. Seuss, this strip of green reminded me of the Lorax by Dr. Seuss. And one of the ends is, the end of the story is, you're in charge of the last of the trufula seeds, and trees are what everyone needs. Plant a new trufula, treat it with care. give it clean water, feed it fresh air, grow a forest, protect it from axes that hack, then Lorax and all his friends may come back. And you must admit, this magical red shank langur looks like the Lorax, and it is a reminder to all of us about why Jeff's work is so important. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Madam Rosina. I think this presentation is very clear and interesting. Now, let me just take this opportunity to open the floor for comments from council members. Thank you. All right, UL, take the floor. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Chair, thank you very much for the opportunity. Very inspiring presentation. I think a lot of good information there. Two things stood out to me coming from the Caribbean constituency. The first one is on climate screening. We think that is a very useful information, great news. We in the region, in the Caribbean, we've used a tool called Sea Coral, which is basically the Caribbean Climate Online Risk Tool, developed by the Caribbean Community Climate Change Center, 5Cs, with support from the US aid. This tool is being used primarily by the public service, the public sector throughout the Caribbean to screen capital projects for its climate resiliency. So whenever the budgets are being prepared throughout the Caribbean region, every project that is being proposed by a various ministry is being screened to ensure that they consider the different impacts those projects are going to have on the environment. So that is very good news. The question on that one is, as it relates to GEF, how do we foresee bringing the private sector on board to use the climate screening tool? Because very often we find that climate screening is driven by the public service and the public sector. And we think that the private sector and their projects should also be in line with screening. So how do we foresee bringing the private sector on board? The second question surrounds the issue of adaptation. Yes, we believe that adaptation is important, that adaptation is critical. But coming from the small island developing states, we face the risk of the events of climate change. Very often, we're a low emitter of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases, but we suffer from the risk of sea level rise. Our economic base, our economic structure is primarily driven by tourism, where our plants are along the seacoast, complemented by agriculture that is very often inland. With adaptation and facing hurricanes of 150 miles per hour, etc., it's going to be a challenge, especially based on our profile, economic structure, high debt levels in small island developing states. For us, we believe that the conversation around mitigation is extremely important, that we have to find ways to lower the risk of rising temperatures because we are at the forefront and we experience the blunt of the changes in climate change. Are we moving away from mitigation with the emphasis on adaptation, or is adaptation essentially going to be the nucleus or to drive the mitigation conversation? Thank you.
Thank you for your input. Inavo.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for a very interesting presentation, with sharing with us a lot of the knowledge what is happening in the development of science and technology globally. Of course, we appreciate the efforts being done by the panel to get the acknowledgement and with the relevance to the environmental issues. But at the same time, may I kindly request the question whether we need to be closer to the main tasks which we at the GEF Council are meeting. to be more precise, why? Because we need information, yes, definitely, but also the scientific and technological advice, what is needed for designing the projects, for the implementation, and of course with the monitoring. And also another question is, it is a really global problem, the climate problem, but at the same time, whether we in the GEF are paying a lot of attention to the climate change adaptation and mitigation, and sorry to say so, but stealing from the Global Climate Fund, what will be left for them? Just to properly identify the place of the GEF and Scientific and Technical Advisory Panel. IPCC report, yes, interesting, it is global, etc. But also, of course, we need what is related to the GEF main tasks which we are facing and what is ahead. Of course, the new tendencies, including a couple of them mentioned in the report, for example, this development of the deep sea exploration of the minerals. Yes, we have the International Seabed Authority in Kingston, Jamaica, which is developing this topic for decades, and now they are close to developing the rules for the environmental procedures which are necessary. Maybe this is closer when we're talking about the global impact on the environment, how this process, and we expect that in the coming couple of years, this exploration really may start in a number of the areas which may affect the developing countries mostly because of the location of these minerals on the deep sea areas. Regarding this blockchain, it is really revolutionary technology, and it leads, of course, to the real new changes, but at the same time, we know that this blockchain technology also consuming a lot of electricity. It is developing fast, but at the same time, of course, we should also consider the risks of its development to the environment. We support the blockchain technology and its use in different areas, including the areas of the GEF. But we need also to calculate the impact on the environment. The gene editing and cellular agriculture, the same. Maybe we supporting all this, but at the same time, of course, we have to be more pragmatic in our approaches. What is within the GEF mandate and how we can assist the projects to be effective to prevent the degradation. In this regard, of course, it is a very good example that this land degradation neutrality has been developed. It is one of the examples when it is very practical, when it is really needed for the countries which are facing the land degradation. And the scientific and technology advice is necessary in this regard, how to make this project really deliver something to the protection of the earth. In this, of course, we support this report and wish the Scientific and Technology Advisory Panel new achievements. Thank you.
Thank you, Inamo. John Peter, followed by Joss, UK.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And thanks for a very interesting presentation. Actually, your presentations are often very interesting. We note with interest the review of the so-called novel entities, including technology-critical elements like rare earth minerals, nanotech, etc. And we generally agree on the conclusion that all these entities have potential for delivering benefits, but also to create problems. We therefore support the conclusion that in the near future, the focus for GEF should be to manage risks and at the same time harness opportunities, but also to improve knowledge and understanding in line with a precautionary approach. Actually, history shows there's usually really no such thing as a free lunch, although when new technologies appear, we sometimes seem to think it is, but it never is. It will probably not surprise you that our constituency strongly supports climate risk screening of GEF activities. On a number of occasions, we have pointed out that GEF programs, in particular when developing into integrative approaches and dealing with issues like land use and food production, such programs need to be extremely serious in managing risks resulting from a changing climate. This also entails managing biodiversity in production landscapes and underpinning production of major food crops. We are yet to see clear evidence that such concerns are yet fully incorporated in GEF programs. We therefore strongly support further STAP advice for climate risk screening. And in particular, we would like to stress the importance of developing impact programs with sufficient climate resilience. We request the staff to keep us informed on these issues. Thank you.
Thank you. Joss, you have the floor.
Yes, thanks very much to the STAP team. I always think this is the most interesting bit of the council, personally. The other bits are necessary, but this bit is interesting as well. I was struck by what you said about risk appetite. And I wondered if you had seen any statements of risk in multilateral institutions that you think help. And by that I mean that aren't just primarily concerned with avoiding bad things. We spent much of yesterday talking about avoiding bad things. We don't spend much time thinking about how to give a leg up to good things. And how to set the bar in our results frameworks, as the IEO had alluded to earlier on, at a level that encourages the right balance of taking risks for good things. So have you seen statements like that in multilateral institutions that help? I was trying to think of one. And then have you a conception of the sorts of activities that a higher risk appetite might engender, or that we might do more of? And what I'm getting at here is this worth the policy? Is this worth a policy effort during GEF 7? Should we think more about it? Should we ask the Secretariat to think more about it? Would it help in terms of targeting our effort? Probably not in GEF 7, but in preparation for GEF 8. And then lastly, thanks very much for all the work you're doing, and to you too, Naoko, on the resilience work for the Commission for the UNSG's event next year, which is a subject very close to the UK's interest, but also globally.
Thank you, Joss. We'll now recognize the CSO network.
Good morning. Thank you for this time to be able to respond. We commend and want, this is on behalf of the GEF CSO network, we commend and want to re-emphasize the staff recommendation that more attention and priority be given to community engagement and ownership, as local and indigenous communities who are the first line stewards and first line impacted by climate change should clearly be the first beneficiaries of GEF activities. The land, oceans, and forests cannot be healthy when the people who live next to them are desperate and starving. We recommend that core indicator 11 on direct beneficiaries clearly indicate that local engagement, local ownership, and local socio-economic benefits be tracked. We are pleased to hear the recommendations related to the use of new technologies to achieve the goals of a GEF. However, we would also point out that implementation will face many challenges on the ground due to persistent technology gaps. For example, how can local people access Earth observation data or use blockchain technologies, which will depend on internet access, when even CSO network members find it hard to have enough internet bandwidth to be able to read the GEF reports ahead of this meeting and be prepared to comment. So a lot of them have been reading the reports just right now, and we're scrambling to write up comments.
Thank you, Laura, followed by Brian. Thank you.
Gracias, señor presidente. En primer lugar, mi circunscripción conformada por Colombia, Ecuador y...
Thank you, Mr. President. And the FBAM for preparing this report and for also presenting it in such an interesting way, especially for those of us who have small children, and we can take this home. We can take something to them. I'd like to echo some of the things that other colleagues have mentioned, and especially that apply to our region, to Latin America. It is very important to take care of the recommendations and take into account the recommendations of the staff, because these are important issues in biodiversity, degraded lands, and climate change. Not only mitigation, but also adaptation. All of this that has been presented, and specifically or especially the new innovations, are strategic advances to improve quality of life of our communities. So I think it is here where we should point out, within the discussions we've had in the last few days, the role that staff should play in accompanying the creation of these projects. I think that you do a revision of these projects when they're sent to the Secretariat, and your comments and recommendations are very technical, but they are very useful to make the adjustments and then design the projects in a certain way. So, and all the challenges that we have in the region, a region that is almost achieving sustainable development, but has many challenges, and we hope to contribute to the solution of these challenges, and of course, within the framework and the impact programs. So we would like to have more of fluor exchange with the different members of the Secretariat, but specifically the staff, so that we can incorporate these key subjects into future projects, especially the ones that we will apply to impact programs. Thank you.
Thank you. Good morning. Rosina, thank you for a captivating presentation. I'd like to welcome the four newest members of panel members to the staff GEF family. We welcome the work that the staff continues to carry out, which improves the work program and brings innovative ideas to the GEF. We're especially glad that the staff will have a formal role in reviewing the IP program documents that will be submitted for consideration at the June Council next year. We appreciate the staff's continual production of papers that ultimately guide GEF programming, including the most recent papers on novel entities and innovation and the GEF. We look forward to understanding further how the ideas put forward in these papers contribute to the production of global environmental benefits produced through activities associated with the conventions the GEF serves. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. Peter, you have the floor.
Thank you. Good morning, colleagues. I will be very quick. I just wanted to thank Rosina for another fantastically enlightening and informative presentation. My two observations were I strongly support the positive approach toward new technology and the benefits to our work that with artificial intelligence or blockchain or whatever it might be. I think we can embrace these technologies rather than be scared that the robots are coming for us. And my second and far more serious point is just to put down a marker that I think it's incorrect to say that there is any age limit on Dr. Seuss readership whatsoever. As an avid Dr. Seuss reader, I'm no longer a child myself. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. Marta, you have the floor.
Muchas gracias. Quería aunarme.
I wanted to join the family of the GEF, and thank you for that entertaining presentation. Really, the photographs should be in postcards. I wanted to simply add to what Laura said of the importance that the staff is in their projects and how important it is to Latin America. And even though we are a region that is pushing forward and trying to attain sustainable development, and we're facing serious challenges at a social and an environmental level. Thank you very much. Anything that we can receive is helpful.
Thank you, Martha. I'm not seeing any flag up. Maybe I can just call on Rosina to provide a response to the concern raised. Thank you.
All right, thank you for all that food for thought. Let me try to answer some of these. Some I think were better directed at the GEF, but just to remind you, I guess we feel the STAP role is twofold. One, to bring science into the GEF, and then to take your needs for science information back out. And so sometimes we develop long, detailed reports, and sometimes we do things that are faster. So I'm very glad that much of it appears to be useful. On Grenada's comments, the action tracks of the Global Adaptation Commission will be including the private sector. And and of course, GEF has plans to involve the private sector more vigorously in GEF 7. But just from a couple of the very recent peer-reviewed articles that I've read, it's becoming increasingly clear that the private sector is no longer just worried about extreme weather events and keeping their operations going. They're actually now thinking about the global supply chains of their material and how, for example, even back as far as 2011, the flood in Thailand affected the ability to buy car parts and hard disks everywhere around the world. So I do think the private sector is becoming activated and is actually, to answer another question, being more interested in looking at its broader risk portfolio. And of course, don't forget that we're seeing a bunch of experiments occurring now, whether it's from private philanthropy making investments on big bets, or so I was thinking of some of the monies that are appearing from Bloomberg and Gates, et cetera. So I think there is an appetite for thinking about bigger, risky projects and thinking about industry and its role and how it can be transformational. Your point about is adaptation replacing mitigation? Absolutely not. And, having written the first and only report that the U.S. Congress asked for in adaptation in 1992, I would say that, adaptation has been something I think we need to think about more than we have. But of course we need mitigation. I think the reason adaptation has finally burst on the scene is that the pace and magnitude of climate change is such that we are seeing the impacts already. And so one of the reports that we did for the United Nations in 2007 was called Avoiding the Unmanageable. That is, mitigate so you don't get into territory where you cannot cope, and then manage the unavoidable, which is adaptation, manage that which you cannot avoid by mitigation. So we absolutely need both. We need them as fast as possible, but those very sharp drops in emissions that are needed to get to 1.5 or 2 show you there's going to be a lot to adapt to. And so I didn't mean to imply one was more important than the other. On the Russian Federation's comments, we do try to provide some very detailed advice on design, on implementation, and on monitoring. So, for example, that paper on integration grew out of our thinking on what should a multifocal area project consider? Like, why do you paste together 2 or 3 areas? Well, there has to be a theory of change that argues you need these to work together. Well, then how do you know you're successful? So there's been an evolution from trying to develop some really precise information in some places to moving to the grander thinking, the horizon scanning of technologies and policies in countries where we work that may make our work different. And so, for example, the environmental security piece that we did for the Assembly, 40% of GEF projects are in pre or post-conflict countries. We don't really do anything special because of that, but that's a kind of risk that we think actually should be considered. On the risk question, I guess, let's see, did I miss? I think, Josh, you were asking me about risk. I think, you know, if we're going to increase our level of ambition to catalyze transformational change, I think it means that the portfolio of investments has to have, you know, some different risk characteristics, and particularly probably at the IP level. And we want to learn, you know, across these. So with the impact programs being our big new transformational entry point, I think this, what kind of appropriate portfolio of risk, which is really a policy decision of the GEF, not of the STAP, is something that we should absolutely consider. On the CSO comment about capacity building and who has the technology, very important question. And another project that I was involved in pre-STAP was looking at a portfolio of adaptation projects in the GEF, and even those which intended to put forward new technologies, the biggest part was always about capacity building, because, you know, if there's nobody able to receive or use those technologies, the technology is not an answer. And so, yes, capacity building in sync with trying to take advantage of new technologies, very, very important. Colombia, we welcome a fuller exchange with you on all kinds of things, including the IPs. Very grateful to the U.S. and to Australia for liking Dr. Seuss. And please know that all of the STAP family is very interested in talking in as much detail as any of you want about any of the things we proposed or could propose that you would find useful for GEF 7.
Okay. Thank you, Rosanna. I believe that brings us to the end of the agenda item. Or moving to the next agenda. Okay. Okay, thank you. Sorry.
Thank you, Rosina, and thank you for the Council for the very lively interaction. And there are a few questions which are actually addressed to me, so that then let me do my part. Regarding this private sector question, in fact, as Rosina also already mentioned, and I have seen that more and more private sector actually engaging in interested in with GEF portfolio because of the climate risk. That because of their supply chain are kind of threatened, because they actually see the needs for us to actually to work together to how to address those climate risks. So that's one. But for the adaptation side, I think I mentioned in my opening, the one takeaway from the Katowice week is that more and more private sector really got interested in adaptation, and not necessarily only risk appetite or risk side, but also the business opportunity side. So that, for instance, I had a very good conversation about the insurance company, how to put the price on coral and through tourism industry, that so that they can ensure that the coral, actually the nature through a tourism industry. So there are quite a lot of opportunity they have also seen. So that I see that the involvement of the private sector through this climate risk or climate opportunity may become much more important going forward. That's number one. The second thing about a few of you suggested about what is actually the best use of STAP to the council. I actually see this maybe two different ranges. The one that the STAP always give us a big picture that from the science, and also that they are very helpful for us to foresee what's coming next. So that from big picture and also the screening and the horizon, I think they are absolutely important role they are playing. And then it actually impacted us to come up with GEF 7, for instance, why we think that we need we are aiming at catalyzing the system change, because that's a message from the science. I mean, that the challenge is really growing, and that's much faster speed and scale. And we need to find a way for the GEF to address that, so that the entire GEF 7 strategy, in my view, is based on the science message, and that is our response to the science. So that from that point of view, that the STAP always give us a very important push to to really think through that what's the role of the GEF in this battle. In terms of the horizon, screening horizon, you may recall, for instance, that the marine plastic report, now it's a fashion. But you may remember that the first STAP report on the marine plastic is 2011. They are much ahead of time, ahead of curve. So that they have been playing the very important role to really tell us that the fact may be coming, so that we are very grateful that kind of big picture thing, but also that screening the horizon kind of thing. So that is a kind of one role that they are doing. But the second role, I think that it's maybe also closer to the council's day-to-day business, is that they have been absolutely helpful to for us to think through how we can do integration. That an IAP report is very much based on that there. Also, the study that how the integration actually then produced the better results, and then it was actually back to 2013 or 14, the very early days. And even it was before the GEF 6 is concluded. And now that we have been very much helped that how we can do the system change, so that our important program are very much actually the coming together or going together with the help of the staff. So from that point of view, that their scientific assistance is kind of that the backbone or of our a new trial of the new programming, and that they give us a lot of confidence and for us to try new things. So, and it is all in addition to their review, scientific review of the all projects submitted to you, so that they are always doing from very much close the nitty-gritty to the very high-end and foreseeable future. So I just would like to mention that how I see from the Secretariat point of view that how we are working together from various angles. My last point about encouraging risk. Yeah, to me, we always, of course, have to think about how do no harm. But I think we were also really doing more like how we can try or do good. And then GEF 6 integration to GEF 7 catalytic and catalyzing system change. It's all try to do how we can do good. And everything that we try to do good, a new thing, involves certain kind of risks. So it's not just and the risk is quite diverse from implementation. Then can we really try that the small GEF can really be a catalyst of that change, and how we can handle complexity, how we can bring the all different actors together. There are a lot of risks in it, but it's actually, in my view, it's worth trying. And that from that point of view, I very much appreciated the staff's help for us going forward in terms of that IP project design, that starting that framework, and also going to each of the child project, so that we are very much committed and looking forward to working together with the staff and to go further and actually and deeper. So my appreciation to the staff and my commitment to you, the council members, that we will bring that together to your table. So let me stop here.
Thank you, Madam Naoko. That brings down the curtain on that subject matter. I would just want to invite the Independent Evaluation Office to also look at the next agenda item, which is on semi-annual evaluation report for November 2018 and management response. Are you office unit, please come?
Oh, I was asked to move it.
Yeah.
Okay, no problem.
Either way?
Yeah, that's good.
So on that note, I want to invite Mr. Johan to please take us through the agenda item. Thank you.
Okay, good morning, everybody. Dr. Seuss, right? Rosina is always a hard act to follow because she presents very interesting stuff and in a very lively way. We tried to do something interesting here also, including the fact that, you know, as we started in the assembly in Vietnam in June, so we have produced a couple of small videos that will interrupt my droning for a while. Okay, so we are gearing up again. You know, OPS 6 was completed a year ago, and there was a little bit of a lull in evaluative work after that, although we did some work before. But now we are again getting into speed to Horace think about OPS 7, which actually has to be delivered in 3 years' time. So our evaluative work is geared towards those goals. And therefore, the first piece that I'm going to present today relates to a methodological innovation that we are going to be using in our evaluations, if the Council so wishes. Let me just, however, comment on, we didn't have an opportunity to participate in the discussion yesterday about the annual project monitoring report, the APMR, which did reference the IEO and our work at very, to a very extensive degree, and it highlighted particularly the fact that the things that the Council members really hooked on the gap between the ratings of self-reporting by the agencies and IEO rating. Just a minor point to, I mean, not such a minor point, but a fine point to clarify there is that we at the IEO, we base our work very much on the rating of the terminal evaluations of the projects at the end of their life cycle, whereas the APMR, to a large extent, also referred largely to the PIRs, the implementation review reports. But having said that, that's a clarification, and we will conduct some work in the near future related to the self-reporting systems and the monitoring and evaluation systems of the agencies. So, okay, so let me get to my presentation and start with this study that we did on evaluative approach to assessing GEF's additionality. And what we propose here is actually that this would become a mainstay of our evaluative work in the future. So the justification for this is that, you know, since its inception, the GEF has intended to serve as a catalyst for greater global action on global environmental issues, and the incremental cost principle has been one of the fundamental aspects of GEF's work in measuring the indirect and direct impacts of the GEF's work. However, already about 10 years ago or 12 years ago, a dozen years ago, the IEO, that was obviously much before my time, found that the analysis of the incremental cost added quite little to the operational aspects of project preparation, and it had become a fairly generic and standardized way of justifying GEF action. The members of the Council have also as well as those people from the implementing agencies, have been often informally expressing interests to us that there should be a simple and understandable approach to assessing GEF's environmental additionalities. And also, I should say that there's also the aspect that if you only focus on the incremental cost, so you risk actually to under-report on important aspects of GEF's work. So we have looked into academic literature as well as the practice in the other multilateral or in the multilateral development banks about how do they think about additionality. And we have identified, and we did a fairly comprehensive study here and looked into aspects that could be codified as something more formal in defining GEF's additional value added to things. Of course, you have the specific environmental additionality, which is basically building upon on the classic incremental cost approach. But you have different areas where the GEF has actually proven to work, and these include, for example, legal and regulatory additionality, where the GEF helps stakeholders transformational change to environmentally sustainable legal regulatory reforms and forms and so forth, and the same with institutional and governance aspects. Interestingly so we had just a big discussion on risk and innovation in the GEF programming, and this is something that we've been all discussing for a few years now. How do we actually encourage risk-taking and innovation, and actually reward it without just simply lowering the threshold for success? So we looked into innovation additionality here, and in particular how the GEF provides an incremental cost which is associated with transforming a project with national and local benefits into something that has global environmental benefits. Our screening of projects at this stage actually found that only 11% of the projects actually mention innovation as something that they are going after, and that's pretty low. Whereas, almost all of the projects refer to, of course, to the environmental benefits, the global environmental benefits they go after, but only 11%, one in 10 projects looks, explicitly defines innovation as something else. And there are also other things. There are things related to things like socio-economic benefits, and we think that this is, of course, very important that the GEF beneficiaries actually do benefit from the work. So, I think, So, what we here conclude is that there is still a certain challenge in demonstration and clear attribution of results to GEF interventions. And we suggest that this kind of a broader approach to additionality would strengthen GEF's approach to demonstrating its results, and would also, make it clearer for GEF to work on on its programming here. So the theory of change is a fundamental thing here. How do we really assess GEF's additionality and the pathways through which it contributes to these six dimensions of additionality? Now, so what we would like the Council to consider is to endorse this application of these six dimensions of additionality in our evaluation work, initially at least in our evaluation work, and this is doable, and I will show you how it has been done, because we used in these two evaluations that I'm going to talk about next. We applied this framework to these evaluations, and I think it works. So the first of these evaluations is of GEF support to biodiversity mainstreaming. We took a look at, as is our wont, we start with the portfolio approach, and we took a look at the portfolio in biodiversity mainstreaming, which is actually, I should say, it's something that is roots in the Convention on Biodiversity, which has stated that all parties should integrate as far as possible and as appropriate the conservation and sustainable use of biological diversity into relevant sectoral or cross-sectoral plans, programs and policies. So the GEF has responded to this call from CBD, and there has been an increasing number of projects in the portfolio that has, especially since GEF 3, but especially after in later years, an increase of projects in this concerning biodiversity mainstreaming in productive sectors. These projects have been distributed quite widely across geographies, but more than half of these projects, probably understandably, have focused on natural resources in forestry and agriculture and associated sectors. And overall, our evidence shows that the performance has been actually pretty good. Actually, I've said that already. So how did we go about this evaluation? So we took a in-depth approach to looking into biodiversity mainstreaming in GEF in 3 countries: Colombia, India, and South Africa. So there is a method to the madness, actually. Why did we select these countries? I mean, there were a number of criteria that we applied in selecting the countries, and they included the fact that, first of all, these are all mega diverse countries in different regions that have really significant biodiversity issues when it comes to threats affecting diverse landscapes and ecosystems, and threats emanating from deforestation, land and water degradation, and so forth. And you have issues of how do you deal with these issues, these problems also. They all have their frameworks that include the national biodiversity strategic action plans, and they have protected area systems, but also then have focused on the long term in biodiversity mainstreaming, and have a long history with the GEF. So here comes our first video that is based on our field visits in Colombia.
Colombia is ranked 3rd in the world in biodiversity. houses, for example, the highest variety of birds on the planet, but faces threats to biodiversity that affect unique landscapes and ecosystems. These include migration, deforestation, extensive cattle ranching, unlicensed mining operations, and until recently, armed conflict and cultivation of illegal crops. Since 1993, the GEF has worked with different implementing agencies and national executing partners in Colombia to tackle the country's most pressing threats to biodiversity. An independent evaluation of the GEF's biodiversity mainstreaming programs in Colombia highlights the following results. The evaluation found that the GEF's projects have taken successful steps towards mainstreaming biodiversity, even when most are still ongoing. For example, in the heart of the Amazon, a GEF-supported project was able to negotiate conservation agreements with individual farmers in exchange for agricultural inputs and technical guidance on non-timber food crops.
Un proyecto muy bueno. Es el único proyecto que nos ha pagado por sembrar, por ejemplo, nuestros árboles.
In the region of Chocó, the GEF worked with grassroots organizations to curb land degradation and water contamination resulting from unlicensed gold mining by improving landscape management, biodiversity protection, vigilance of illegal mining, and policy action. Also, funding was provided for startup enterprises harvesting heart of palm, acai fruit, and producing natural cosmetic and bathing products.
Nosotros que venimos haciendo, venimos buscando productos no maderables que le generen ingresos a las comunidades, o sea, a la gente.
Another GEF-supported project used carbon payments as incentive for coffee growers to return to the practice of planting native trees along coffee rows for natural shade, fertilizer and pest control, and biodiversity conservation. The evaluation found positive results for both coffee growers and the environment.
Uno ve los resultados de cada vez de más calidad, se aplica un poco de menos abono químico porque estamos incorporando buena vegetación y la idea era hacer unos corredores, como pueden ver aquí al frente, que conectan con el Parque Nacional Tatamá.
A mí me han llamado ya como unas 3 o 4 veces. Me han dado, no ha sido mucho, pero me han dado platica para lo de la captura del carbono.
A similar GEF-supported initiative lets cattle ranchers in the eastern savannas of Colombia collect carbon payments when they successfully adopt sustainable ranching practices that mitigate deforestation, such as live fencing, planting native trees, and rotating cattle between grazing areas. This project is now being replicated on a broader scale through larger programs and donors. These advances in biodiversity mainstreaming have been possible thanks to the influential role in scientific research, policy analysis, and advocacy of national partners like the Humboldt, Sinchi, and Pacific Institutes, which led the charge in knowledge management and socialization of research findings across Colombia. The participation of minority communities in managing biodiversity on communal lands was also an essential factor highlighted by the evaluation. Another contributing factor was the program's alignment with national biodiversity priorities, boosted by political and policy continuity. Moreover, incentives like land tenure security and carbon payments played a crucial role in getting rural communities on board with biodiversity conservation in high biodiversity areas. However, the evaluation finds that the implementation and impact of these activities are affected by a few challenges. Mainstreaming biodiversity takes time and long-term commitment that usually exceeds the duration of GEF project timelines. Coordinating with partner organizations that are often dispersed and limited in technical capacity and resources can pose a challenge to program delivery. Finally, the evaluation points to the lack of ex-ante and ex-post analysis of mainstreaming projects as a major challenge in securing long-term conservation commitments and adoption of biodiversity-friendly practices.
Okay, let me continue and talk a little bit about South Africa, which is one of the, obviously also one of these most biologically diverse countries in the world, but where biodiversity is threatened by issues mostly related to poverty and inequality, low employment rates, and the need for a really fast and broad-based economic growth. There, the GEF has been supporting 9 projects for $62 million in grants focused on biodiversity mainstreaming over the past few years, since GEF 7 actually. And what we found is that things like spatial planning, data and tools, and financial mechanisms have been the main mechanisms for mainstreaming of biodiversity in South Africa. And you see from these maps that they have covered quite broadly major biomes and globally recognized biodiversity hotspots in the country. Our conclusion is, well, the GEF has played a uniquely high-value role in enabling South Africa's mainstreaming of biodiversity. And the GEF has also enabled private sector funding for mainstreaming, notably via co-financing in the mining, wine, and tourism sectors. So the South African biodiversity mainstreaming has benefited from a central knowledge hub to produce these benefits. But again, so the experience shows that mainstreaming does require trust, it does require mutual learning and integration across sectors and institutions. So again, we'll have a little video on the third country case study, India.
India is considered a mega biodiverse country. It is home, for example, to the highest population of tigers on the planet, but faces unique threats to biodiversity. These include high population and economic growth, land use changes from increased urbanization and intensification of agriculture, and deforestation, among others. Since 1994, the GEF has worked with different implementing agencies and national executing partners in India to tackle the country's most pressing threats to biodiversity. An independent evaluation of the GEF's biodiversity mainstreaming programs in India highlights the following results. The evaluation found that overall, GEF-supported activities in India have made good progress towards curbing the negative impacts that production sectors exert on biodiversity outside protected areas. An early GEF World Bank project helped set the stage for biodiversity mainstreaming in India through environmental awareness and commitment of local communities to land management and conservation. The project also pioneered the creation of the Periyar Tiger Conservation Foundation. On the Malvan coast, another GEF-supported initiative contributed to bringing positive regulatory changes to some aspects of the fishery sector, such as the use of bycatch reduction devices by fishermen, with less success in adjusting the regulatory framework for the tourism sector. By working with GEHAM farmers on when to correctly rotate crops and setting up credit facilities to support conservation activities and women's self-help groups, a GEF-supported project in Nagaland led to significant improvements in land productivity, soil erosion, vegetation cover, and income for both farmers and women. To date, the government of Nagaland has plans in place to scale up sustainable GEHAM cultivation practices across the state in collaboration with other donors. These advances in biodiversity mainstreaming have been driven by several contributing factors: awareness raising and capacity building, as well as involving relevant stakeholders and choosing the right institutional partner with recognized technical capacity and scope, have been central to creating the enabling conditions for mainstreaming. Several projects in the evaluation identified ineffective institutional collaboration and insufficient project duration as challenges to project effectiveness and biodiversity mainstreaming. Finally, the evaluation suggests that the monitoring and evaluation of biodiversity mainstreaming projects needs to be improved going forward.
Okay, thanks very much for your attention. I just love those tiger cubs. I could watch them the whole day. Anyway, just to try to summarize, what are the conclusions from these three case studies and the overall analysis that we had? And so there are a number of factors that have been influencing success, and these include the fact that you align your interventions with the national plans and policies. You obviously have to work to have institutional, financial, human sustainability, and when you have longer project durations and time frames, that is actually quite important. You need the long-term partnerships with the right partners, and engagement with key stakeholder groups, including grassroots organizations and coalitions, and you need the collaboration with central government to link relevant policy and planning bodies at the central, federal, and project levels here. And obviously, good governance, political will, and all of that is necessary. So overall, we found that the GEF has been responsive and relevant to the implementation of CBD and has been instrumental in supporting national policy reform and planning frameworks in this area. We did apply the additionality framework, and when you read the report, you will see, and it's an information document, you'll see a systematic table-wise presentation of the additionalities, but in general we found that the GEF did contribute to additionalities beyond the incremental cost benefits when it came to issues such as legal, regulatory governance and socio-economic aspects. There were issues, of course, related to project design and so forth, but overall, so when projects are explicitly designed to address these recognized threats to biodiversity, they tend to do better, and you need a strong theory of change on how you deal with this. And at the other end, stronger monitoring and evaluation would be very useful in order for you to be able to track and demonstrate impacts. So what are we recommending here is that it came from all of these case studies that it would be useful to have interventions with a longer term time perspective and a resource envelope that would ensure sustainability. I just talked about the M&E. It needs to be strengthened, and GEF should continue to leverage its convening power to improve policy design and process and strengthen interministerial intersectoral collaboration. I emphasize the word continue to leverage because it is doing it, and this is very important and useful. And you should include a systematic analysis of these associated benefits and trade-offs when it comes to biodiversity mainstreaming in a broader production landscape. So here is a widget. it's a very intelligent device. I am being told that helps people in to optimize natural gas, electricity, and water use, and it has been developed by our partners in Pakistan. You'll find more information on it somewhere, actually. But so we evaluated this clean tech program, which is a program that is implemented by UNIDO on behalf of the GEF. And I feel the need to explain why did we suddenly pick up one program to evaluate. And the reason for this is basically related to the fact that this is part of our evaluative work on private sector, GEF's engagement with the private sector. You will remember that as part of OPS 6, for example, we did an evaluation of the non-grant instrument, the NGI, and we looked at the GEF strategy on private sector and so on. The Council has also highlighted the need for the GEF to not only to work with these large multinational companies, but also to focus on small and medium-sized enterprises in the developing countries, in the countries that benefit from the projects. And we thought that this program was one of the few that was explicitly focused on SMEs here. We also did have an opportunistic opportunity here because many of the projects under this program were being evaluated by UNIDO's evaluation office, so we could join forces with them and again focus on its relevance, whether the program is effective, its direct and indirect impacts as defined in the additionality framework, and the sustainability of outcomes. And yet another film.
The independent evaluation of the GEF UNIDO Global Cleantech Innovation Program examines the GEF's engagement with the private sector through its support to small and medium enterprises developing cleantech innovations around the world. In each country, the GCIP aims to support cleantech startups, build institutional capacity, and strengthen the regulatory framework for cleantech entrepreneurship. The activities are anchored through a local government host, with private sector leaders playing a key role as co-sponsors and champions of the program. Cleantech startups are identified through a competition-based accelerator program in which applications are received. Participants are selected for the program, and winners are identified following several steps, including a 3-day intensive business training academy, individual mentorship by business leaders, and a final pitch to a panel of judges, including investors. National finalists then proceed to a global competition, sponsored by the Cleantech Open. The evaluation found the projects to be highly relevant in helping developing countries transition to low-carbon economies. All GCIP accelerators succeeded in promoting clean tech innovation by conducting small business competitions and acceleration activities. SMEs benefited through the development of business skills and access to mentoring, new markets, and investment. For example, in Pakistan, a tech startup designed an energy-efficient house that can be assembled in 3 hours to provide emergency shelter with plumbing and electricity included. In South Africa, a woman-led startup has developed a reusable, biodegradable sanitary pad that reduces the environmental impact of modern sanitary protection. Its products are available to women and girls in rural areas. In India, another SME recently filled its first commercial order for a fleet of solar-powered ferry boats that doesn't pollute the water and air with CO2. A Turkish startup creating high-tech measurement tools for agriculture is helping farmers maximize yields with rich hyperlocal data about their crops. The evaluation noted a few areas for improvement. These include strengthening the policy and regulatory environment, enhancing the coordination role of the GCIP, linking startups with other suitable partners in the country, working to support technology innovation, and clearly coordinating across country projects to be able to aggregate results, develop networks, and encourage knowledge exchange across countries. The evaluation points at the private sector's involvement as an important way to ensure country ownership and to sustain project results. The evaluation highlights the importance of selecting the right local partner to host the GCIP, especially to ensure a smooth transition to full national ownership at program completion. Otherwise, the accelerator seems destined to not continue, sacrificing important momentum. The results so far suggest that the program has the potential to address environmental challenges and to serve as a key to economic growth.
Yes, so actually the video talked about it quite a lot, but here again, perhaps the interesting thing is that you have been working with SMEs in developing countries, and actually the innovation quotient is quite high in this program. You do need this business development training, mentorship, and opportunities to showcase the technologies that have been identified by the partners as something really important here. The project performance has improved through these factors. And we have indications that this is actually leading to, apart from the innovation in and possible commercialization and spread of these important environmental technologies, that they actually you will have greenhouse gas reductions as a direct result of this program. I have to say, though, that this has been not measured in any systematic manner, and it's actually interestingly some of these companies that have benefited from the program that have taken it upon themselves to start quantifying their greenhouse gas benefits. So again, we looked into the additionality, and we found that there are many levels of additionality of this program here, and not least the innovation in this particular case. So some of the challenges that we identified relate to the linkages to the larger national level policy and regulatory frameworks and the overall program. So we have to say that although this has been designed as a program for the GEF, in practice it still operates very much as a bunch of country level projects that take the same approach, but there would be more scope for actually raising it to a truly programmatic level at an international level, and also then better linking it to the broader outcomes and including the climate benefits of the program, and not just the individual projects. So basically our recommendations follow from this. The program is still ongoing, and there are projects that can be benefiting from these recommended approaches at this stage, but also that if the GEF so decides that it will adopt similar approaches in the future in other programs or so forth. So the lessons that we think is that really the fact that they should be more at the globally coordinated level and also measuring then the benefits at the overall level better, and that you have to allow sufficient time for policy strengthening and regulatory frameworks and linking these individual innovations and highly innovative projects into the national frameworks. And you could also expand the network of private sector partners and in general linking it better at the national level. Okay, that's what we've done since the assembly, basically, since the last council meeting. So we've kept ourselves relatively busy. But we have also other stuff, and I just wanted to give you a heads up on what we are doing at this stage. So in the June Council meeting, you can expect an update on the annual performance report as we do every year. This time we have taken or are currently, as we speak, taking a more detailed look at the GEF's experiences with transportation. We will have a study or an evaluation of GEF's support to scaling up impacts, and we'll have a value for money analysis of GEF's support to sustainable forest management. And you'll remember that we did a value for money analysis earlier as part of OBS 6 on land degradation and biodiversity projects. We shall also present to you an updated GEF evaluation policy, and I believe that the Secretariat will present a monitoring policy. There are various reasons why we decided to separate these two at this stage, and that is actually the practice that most multilateral organizations follow, because monitoring is primarily a management function and evaluation is a different type of analytical function. So I'll be happy to explain more, but you'll have these two separate policies. We also have work underway on 3 cluster evaluations, which is, I mentioned it earlier. I think that we wanted to start this work because the Council has been expressing interest in how the GEF works in Africa, in LDCs, in SIDS, and similarly, I think Rosina was the one who said that that a large segment, 40% of projects are in fragile settings. So we will look into what the implications are for the GEF. We also have to work on this study on the self-reporting and self-assessment systems of the agencies. As usual, we've been rather active in the knowledge management sphere. Of course, one very important thing for us has been to disseminate the findings of OPS 6, and we've participated in major related events, including the CBD and the UNFCCC COPs, and we've started talking more about collaboration with the Green Climate Fund's Independent Evaluation Unit, and are having some plans on harmonizing our approaches. We were at the International Waters Conference that took place in November in Morocco, and we continue with our networks. The Earth Eval is this community of practice that we have, that used to be called Climate Eval, but we expanded it to Earth Eval, as a fairly large number of participants actively online. We've done conferences and webinars on that level. but plus then the UN evaluation group and the evaluation cooperation group of the international financial institutions that are our peer groups, where we really want to make sure that we don't fall behind the curve of how evaluation functions do. Then finally, who evaluates the evaluators? That's a question. And when I came here in 2014, I greatly benefited from the fact that the previous my predecessor had actually commissioned a peer review of the IEO, which was conducted together with the UN Evaluation Group and the DAC evaluation network. It confirmed some of the suspicions that I had, but it also provided some new insights to the challenges of the IEO, and also provided legitimacy for why do we need to change some of our practices. So that's 5 years ago. So I'm proposing to the Council that we would do another peer review of the IEO starting next year. So now here's actually, I should say that there are two possibilities. The UN Evaluation Group promotes, and DAC promote these peer reviews that are commissioned basically by the unit that is that wants itself to be reviewed, and they consist of peers from evaluation units in bilateral and multilateral organizations who will, according to a terms of reference, study whether we are doing fine and where we could improve. The other alternative, which is more in line with the practice of the evaluation cooperation group of the multilateral banks, is an external review. And the difference is that if it's a peer review, I would be the one commissioning it, and there would be peers who my critical friends, I hope, who would tell me how to improve. Whereas the external review would be commissioned by the Council, and you would have to manage it and pay for it, and I say very quickly, and they would report to you. So we have these two options here, and I would very much like to hear from the Council. So you have three options, basically three say that no, IEO is doing so great, so there's no need to review it. Second is, yeah, good, but you do it yourself, you take a peer reviewer approach. Oh no, we want to do it because we want it to be truly external and independent. Okay, that's all, folks. Right.
Thank you very much, Juan. I think I need to call on Madam Naoko to give us kind of a presentation on management response. Thank you.
Thank you, Yoha. We already issued that the management response to you, so I'm not repeating anything. I just would like to welcome and thank that Yoha's work and IO's work, and then particularly for those three evaluation work and the tabled. And just I want to emphasize that particularly this work on the additionality, which is very, very useful to us. And this is very well aligned already with the GEF 7 programming strategy as well as policies, and also that GEF 2020 strategy. So that it's very much, we were actually thinking and working along the same line. GEF 7 that the results architecture also recognize there is a need to capture that a broader range of benefits generated through the GEF projects and programs. So that all in all, that your approach is very much at the heart of our, that day-to-day work, and very much would like to continue to work with you. And so the Secretariat fully supports the recommendation provided by the IO that particularly applied the proposed approach in the future evaluations. We're very much looking forward to the outcome of that. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Madam Naik. I now open the floor for comments from Council members based on both presentations. Thank you. Kadula, you have the floor, followed by...
Yeah. Well, thank you to Juha for this very interesting introduction, the secrets of your work. And, well, there's two things I would like to touch upon. One is the idea of the peer evaluation. I think it's a very good practice already, it seems, to regularly let you and your team review from outside. I just would like to understand better how the different options that you were proposing to us would actually work. If we as a council would decide we would like an external evaluation, it would also be us who will have to decide on who is going to do it and where would actually the budget come from. Would we need another budget line? And to what extent would it actually be different? Would it not be the same people that we would ask to do it, that you would also ask to do it if it's being done as a peer evaluation? And is there examples from within the GEF? Have we done this externally already at some stage? And who else did this kind of an exercise? And what might be the difference in the outcomes? The other aspect, I think this evaluation on additionality is actually a very challenging one. It's an issue, I think, which not only preoccupies the GEF. We also know that other institutions are struggling with this issue, especially within the GCF. We are talking about additionality, and so I was wondering how far you are actually coordinating your work with the GCF and eventually also the evaluation unit within the GCF, because this is an issue, at least for the climate relevant benefits, which would be interesting for both institutions. Thank you.
Thank you, Kadura. Namo, followed by Marita.
Thank you. Thank you, Juha, and your team for the very resultant work and excellent presentation. It is, frankly speaking, straight to the point what we need now if we are talking about increasing the effectiveness of the GEF implementation process. In this regard, of course, it is worth support and good results on the very precise analysis of the whole project cycle, starting from the design up to the implementation with the involvement of different stakeholders. And of course, I encourage you to continue in the same manner, both combining not only excellent analysis in the static, what do we have now, but also with the recommendations, with your vision of the different stages of the project implementation policies. And of course, when you are making the case study presentation, like for example, this GEF UNIDA Global Clean Tech Innovation Program, it's excellent because we know that UNIDA is working really very good in this regard with the developing countries in Africa, in Asia. And of course, when you are analyzing the whole program, it helps us also to understand how these projects are working. And of course, with this also there is the maybe question or request whether we can also analyze the evaluation office, not only the whole project cycle, but also the stakeholders involved, because we are discussing the role of the independent agencies, of the focal points, of the national governments, etc., how we can achieve better results and to increase the effectiveness with a full understanding what is the weak points in different, whether it is on the design study, when in implementation, monitoring report, terminal evaluation. So for us it will be better, so we can then build up the future programming, understanding well where we have to pay more attention and which decisions Council has to undertake to increase the effectiveness. Thank you.
Thank you, Inamu. Marita, I have the floor, followed by Paola.
Thank you. And thank you to Juha and his team for 3 very interesting evaluations, each presenting recommendations that we can support and that we also think will contribute to more effective and sustainable use of GEF resources. The first one of additionality is of particular interest to us, and we think this would have the potential to contribute to strengthen the results reporting. We can support the proposed 3rd peer review. I think I said that we support the recommendations already. Thank you.
Thank you. Paola, you have the floor, followed by Stephanie.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you for the very interesting and usual and useful evaluations, which give us important recommendations on how to make our work more effective and efficient. I will limit myself to a couple of observations on the notion of additionality. And let me say that I'm sorry to see the incremental cost go. I was there when the notion was introduced, and it was a very fascinating one at the time. We understand that it hasn't worked in practice as expected. So yes, additionality, absolutely, and I concur with Cordula. It is something other organizations are thinking about and a bit struggling with, and not only the Green Climate Fund, but also MDBs, and including our host and trustee, the World Bank. There is ongoing work at the G20 level, particularly on private sector, which of course makes the notion particularly relevant. It is a clear and simple premise, meaning that intervention, in this case financed by the GEF, should make a contribution beyond what is already available. So it's very simple and clear-cut, but determining the presence of additionality is far more complex. In this regard, let me say one thing. Additionality, to my mind, is not the same as development impact, although the two are intimately linked. Additionality refers to the key financial and non-financial, as you rightly pointed out, input brought by the GEF, in this case, to a project or a program to make this project or investment happen, or to make it happen much faster than it would otherwise, or to improve its design, and yes, its development impact. But additionality is a threshold condition. It should be a sine qua non for considering a potential intervention, whereas development impact captures the results that the project or program or investment is expected to deliver. So the two are intimately linked, but not exactly conceptually identical. And of course, the input and attributes brought by an organization like the GEF as source of additionality can be considered as essential for the materialization of the development impact. But again, the two are not the same. And of course, after determining that additionality is present, other criteria come into play when making decisions on projects. They involve financial viability, portfolio implications, strategic relevance, sustainability, and others. Yes, additionality, very supportive of the idea of adopting this lens, and it should be, again, not only an instrument for the evaluators to evaluate project at completion, but it should be an instrument for us in screening projects and programs for financing. And it should be underpinned by, as noted, a robust theory of change, and by evidence. So additionality should be demonstrated. And it should be based, and assessment should be based on evidence. So my suggestion and recommendation to the Secretariat in this case, not only to the evaluators, and we take note of the management response, but it would be useful, I think, going forward, to make the notion more operational and to develop this concept further by sort of developing the types of evidence that are relevant for the GEF. And we heard the categories pointed out by the evaluators, but to sort of flesh out this a bit further, to demonstrate the value addition of the GEF, so that going forward, when we received project proposals, we have a robust narrative on the key sources of additionality for that project, on why those matter for the project success, and the link, of course, to the development impact expected, to the impact of the global environmental, in our case, benefits expected, and also the complementarity with other sources of financing. Thank you. That's it.
Thank you, Paola. Stefan, followed by Apana.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Juha, and your team for the always interesting report, and also thanks to the Secretariat for its management response. We appreciate the report and the presentation, and following up on some of the comments that were made on additionality. Yes, I believe it is one of the points that is also at our heart. In November, I was in Parliament's committees to get the credit line for the GEF, the LDCF, SCCF, and the Ozone Fund. And of course, the question always comes up, what has the GEF achieved? And you don't want to oversell what the GEF has done. You don't want to be like the rooster that claims glory for the sunrise just because the two things coincide. But the metrics are very difficult, because sometimes an early engagement by the GEF with modest amounts of money can trigger a good development. So it is needed, I think, not only Parliament committees, but also council members, stakeholders, the GEF family at large would like to know that. Not being an evaluator, I just shove that at you, and I'm sure that you and your team and all the intelligent people in the agencies will come up with a viable way of improving what we already have. It's not that we have nothing in that area. On the point of evaluation the evaluators. I think it's a good thing to do from time to time. If I got you right, Juha, you were asking who should be mainly involved. Speaking for ourselves here, I would say I wouldn't see us as a council being in the driver's seat together with external evaluators, but I believe council would appreciate being informed on terms of reference of such an evaluation and timelines and who the external peer evaluators, reviewers would be. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Stephen. Apana, followed by Juan.
I would just like to thank IEO and his team for a very lucid presentation on very arcane topics. I think we have in the GEF Council continuously been benefited by your products, and I am sure that, as Nauko just mentioned, the GEF family and the executive arms also feels that this contributes to ensuring that GEF becomes more and more effective in every program cycle. I have three comments to make, which I hope will be useful. One is regarding additionality. Yes, as others have also mentioned, and Paula has explained in detail, I think this is something which can make GEF stand out, given its modest volumes of funding. I think establishing additionality is going to be one of the critical elements, not just for fundraising, but also for encouraging more participation in of GEF catalyzed large programs, particularly as we move more towards the integrated and systemic effects of the impact programs. I would be interested in how you approach ex-ante assessment of the additionality. I know, for example, it was just mentioned about the World Bank. The IFC, the International Finance Corporation, has a tool. It has developed just this year, last year, and they are going about it, but they are more actually into metrics being in the private sector. So I would be interested in how this is done, one. Number two, in a slightly different context, but related, I am extremely encouraged by the sentence in para 27. Due consideration should be given to transitional costs and short-term socio-economic trade-offs that may precede benefits. I think this is extremely insightful. It comes from the ground and it helps to inform decision-making and response when we see that the expected outcomes are a little different from what we would like them to be. The second comment I would like to make is regarding the metrics and the indicators. You have mentioned the hierarchical indicators. In that context, of course, I agree with the evaluation report and also urge Nauko to look at a good mix of qualitative and quantitative indicators. I think this is something very valuable, and it's also not just good for assessing the impact, but it is also important for being able to strengthen monitoring and evaluation and look at longer-term effects across project cycles. Also look at sustainability of benefits from projects. So that's my second comment. And the third comment is regarding the importance of being able to use GEF's convening power to influence policy and regulatory framework. This is also a very, in my opinion, critical takeaway from the presentation and the report that is before us in two ways. One is, as we move more for leveraging and co-financing, I think policy and regulatory framework being in place is going to be very critical. I do not think it is possible to leverage, particularly from private sector, in a policy vacuum. That may lead to more, adverse impacts than benefits. That is one. And the second is the very nice evaluation that has been done on the GCIP that also points out the importance of having policies in place at national and subnational levels for encouraging innovation from the outside government. In fact, many innovations come from outside government, and also enabling national governments to support these innovations through having a startup promotion policy, etc. So these are my three comments which I would like to take away from the report, and I encourage IEO to continue to delve deeper into what we can learn from experience to improve the effectiveness. So thank you for the report, and thank you also, Nauko, for your very positive response. Thank you.
Thank you, Apana. Juan, you have the floor, followed by John Peters.
So, thank you, Co-Chair. And I also thank IEO's very informative study and presentation. I like it very much. And as you just mentioned, I really agree that, the STEP report always, inspire us aspiration for the bright future. But the IEO's report always drags us back to the reality to remind us that, there are a lot of work to be done. So, but back to the evaluation regarding the additionality, I think it's extremely important for us to, to think how to better, analyze the least important component at the beginning of the designing and implementing project. So we would like to endorse the recommendation of application this broader approach to assess the GEF additionality in the IEO's evaluations. But we would also like to advise to suggest that the Secretariat to get some, revisions on the PIF format and the template to include this important component to facilitate an effective, screening on whether we would like to support a project or program in the future. Because if without a concrete and clear justification on that, I don't think, we, could, utilize our limited resources in an appropriate way. So, and in this regard, I would like to listen to the feedback from the Secretariat. But I heard, Secretariat is preparing your response to the evaluation, or you already have, but I haven't had that one with me. But I would like to look at that. And the second one is about the methodology or the format of our discussion on the IEO's report. It is should be a complete cycle. I mean, we could, have the findings from the IEO's report, and then on the other hand, we have the feedback on response from the Secretariat or the other IAs. So for the GCIP evaluation report, we would like to to listen to the feedback from the UNIDO, which is the important implementing agency of that program. Otherwise, you put a lot of very interesting and useful recommendations, but we would like to see the concrete follow-up on those recommendations. And I think it's extremely important for our IAs to further improve their, performance. And the last one is about the peer review on IEO, and we'll be fine with this idea. But at the same time, I would like to say we, at least from my personal perspective, we really like the work and the job done by IEO, and we really appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you, Juan. John Peters, followed by Just UK.
Thank you, Chair. And we'd also like to thank for an interesting presentation. Last time, the semi-annual evaluation report had a strong emphasis on sustainability. This is not the case today, but we would like to note that this issue needs to be revisited again and again, and this is also why we have asked to add this item on the agenda to this meeting. We think that the IEO should continue with and strengthen their involvement in evaluating sustainability of GEF programs and projects, and we would specifically like to request that the IEO systematically assess sustainability of a GEF project in all post-project program evaluations. Starting from challenges regarding additionality, the report comes up with some concrete and ambitious proposals to broaden the conceptual framework. This has been mentioned by others. In particular, I would like to refer to what was said by Italy. We can fully support efforts to create more transparency and visibility for benefits and co-benefits. At this stage, however, we propose a somewhat cautious approach when quantifying such co-benefits. Are there risks of double counting? Many of these elements are also seen as part of mainstream regular benefits of development work. Also, we should keep in mind that the core mandate of GEF is environmental. We would appreciate some comments from the IEO and the Secretariat on striking the right balance here. The part of the report dealing with biodiversity mainstreaming points out there are few cases of so-called accelerated mainstreaming with real effects at systemic levels. So there is still room for improvements, it seems. On a number of occasions, even a few minutes ago, on the last agenda item, our constituency has asked how mainstreaming is taken care of when moving into programs dealing with land use and in particular food production. In times of climate change, any program aspiring to sustainability would need to ensure that suitable plant and animal varieties with sufficient climate resilience will be available over time. In the replenishment negotiations, some amendments to the program documents dealt with precisely these issues. We hope the IEO will monitor how these policies are implemented in the coming years. And finally, we have read the chapter on work in progress with interest. In particular, we look forward to the presentation of the analysis of GEF support to SFM RED projects in the next Council meeting. Given our great interest and involvement in these issues, we would certainly be interested in providing any relevant information or viewpoints to this process, if there is interest. We also support plans to conduct a peer review of the IEO and look forward to further terms of reference in the next Council meeting. Thank you.
Thank you, John Peters. Joss, you have the floor, followed by Laura.
Yeah, thanks very much for this. Also a very interesting part of the meeting. We can support the decision as proposed, but I just wanted to pick up on the point that Norway just made on the sustainability question. That was our Achilles heel in OPS 6, as we understand it. And yes, you gave some attention to that in the last meeting, but we would like to see a running commentary on the work you're doing on this, because it seems to be the most difficult element of work to improve on, particularly in relation to the questions of financial and institutional sustainability, which came up here again in your evaluations, with questions about continuing finance, projects being too short, lack of institutional connection. All the things you said in OPS 6 were here again. So we'd like to see a running commentary or a continuing programme of focus on these questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Joss. Laura, you have the floor, followed by Martha.
Gracias, señor.
Thank you, Chair. We would like to thank the Office of the Independent Evaluation for the report. In the case of Colombia, we would specifically like to thank the joint work that we had with the visit of the evaluators from that office. This helped us to understand how this type of independent evaluation works and how these different biodiversity projects do contribute to the global objectives. So it's important to mention that in the biodiversity area, in our region, we have to evaluate the financial and technical resources. How will we attain these national goals for biodiversity? And that includes aligning it with the national development plans, long-term partnerships, the incorporation of different stakeholders. So this brings us to the interesting discussion that was posed by Italy, Norway, and others regarding additionality beyond the incremental costs or including incremental costs. This, of course, then makes us see how we work with other sectors. And it's a discussion that we have also had in the Convention of Biodiversity. How do we mainstream biodiversity in practice, and how that also makes us work with the private sector also, but in the end, create better lifestyles for the different populations. And that is where we agree with what Aparna spoke about co-financing. We have understood through the years that co-financing is not just to show more resources for the same objectives in the projects, but co-financing means how to co-join wills and the compliance of these global commitments. And this has to do with the sustainability of the projects. We're working with the challenges of these biodiversity challenges that will allow us to add value with innovation as a tool. And this is what we're trying to integrate so that we can work on the portfolio of the GEF 7. So we very much appreciate what the IEO is doing. Thank you very much. Marta tiene la palabra. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to thank the IEO also, and listening to the experience of Colombia, with whom we have shared that experience. I'd like to request that we be included not also in the Amazon biomass, but you have the one for Congo there, but the rest of the countries in Latin America, with the understanding that these evaluations provide feedback and they allow us to better understand the work that is being done, which as a result of this multi-sectorial work is very important. So to have that feedback is very important so that we can see that what we're doing with technical evaluation would be of great use. Thank you very much.
I want to call on you to respond to some of the comments raised.
Okay. Thank you, everybody, very much for your comments. I think these were very supportive and useful comments. There's not that much that I have to respond to, actually. But let me just say, I mean, the additionality obviously attracted a lot of interest and positive feedback to us. Our intention really is to continue working on these, and I hear support to that idea. I also hear support to which Nauko may want to respond to then on how to take this up in a more upfront manner. As it currently stands, the IEO doesn't get into reviewing projects ex ante, for example. The Secretariat does and the staff does, and so but it's part of this division of labor. I fully agree with Norway and UK comments on that our main raison d'etre is still, the global environmental benefits, and what the other aspects of additionality are there. They can be seen as co-benefits, but they can also be seen as something that is necessary for us to achieve the global environmental benefits. I mean, our earlier research has shown that the legal and regulatory work, for example, is a necessary condition for actually moving towards achieving global benefits, when we cannot only rely on technical work here. But the balance has to be there. I fully agree. It's still the incremental cost, if you wish, the global environmental benefits and the specific environmental additionality that moves the GEF. I also hear very clearly the emphasis on sustainability. We will have to continue evaluating and providing a running commentary, like Josh said, on it. And of course, these things haven't. Not much has changed since OPS 6, so things don't change that quickly. But it continues to be an area where we have to work. Now, there was a specific question on how do we work and coordinate with the independent evaluation unit of the GCF. We have thus far talked with them. I actually visited them 3 weeks ago in connection with a meeting of the evaluation cooperation group of the IFIs, and there was a lot of discussion both with the Secretariat of the GCF and the IEU regarding harmonization of approaches in looking at these things, and this work in progress. And of course, it has taken them for a while to get up and running, but now they seem to be there, so we will continue this thing. On the peer review, I should say about the clean tech, actually. So we have actually worked quite closely with UNIDO in this process, with the UNIDO Evaluation Office, but also with the program side, and the report has been made available to UNIDO at the same time. I cannot, of course, speak on their behalf to this thing. On the peer review, so I heard general support to the idea of having peer review, but if I understood you correctly, so it would be more that we should do it. There is, of course, I mean, these are fairly small circles, so there is a clear risk that whoever does it, so it ends up contracting the same people to do it. But and obviously we'll be happy to manage this process and keep the council posted on it. We will of course share the terms of reference. You will have a chance of commenting on the terms of reference, changing them, improving on them, and we'll keep you posted on the timelines and the processes, and we tend to be fairly sort of like independent-minded in our evaluations also, so I could guarantee that we will not try to exert any undue influence on the peer review either. That's it, or?
No, well, they wanted to know, had a question on how has it been done in other agencies.
Oh yeah. See, so on the peer review, that's right. So there were examples. So the World Bank, for example, the CODI commissioned an external independent review of the IEG function. Asian Development Bank did something similar. These were indeed cases where the whole thing was managed by the board. The reviewers were reporting to the board, to the CODI, and they footed the bill also at that stage. In several UN agencies, it has been done as a peer review, where actually the subject of the review is in charge of, has to pay for its own flagellation, so to say. And so recent examples have included, for example, UNICEF, UNFPA, UNDP had it done a few years back, and others. So both, I mean, I would say that there are more cases of peer review than of external review, but the World Bank case was a notable case.
Can I add one thing on additionality?
Okay, Geeta would like to add.
Since there's been so much interest on additionality, I just wanted to highlight that just as in the case of the transformational change evaluation that we did, we used current projects to try and develop a framework, tested it out on projects, and the idea is, having tested that, it is ready for an ex-ante application pilot. So that's one. It's very similar to the transformational change work that we did. On sustainability, we are doing work. In fact, the next year, the strategic country cluster evaluations have an entire theme focused on sustainability. And based on our previous work, we will be presenting a paper to you next council on GEF's sustainability. On socioeconomic trade-offs, we hear you about the focus being global environment. But we do recognize there are socioeconomic trade-offs in several projects, and our focus on SFM is highlighting that. We will be using proxies. We're not going to go in and collect detailed information, but there's a lot of proxies like night lights for poverty data, etc. We'll be using the World Bank household surveys, matching them with GEF data to try and get an understanding on socioeconomic outcomes. So that's fine. Thank you.
Thank you. May I now invite Naoko? She has some clarifications to make. Thank you.
Thank you so much for a great question and quite interest of how the GEFSEC is kind of responding to this evaluation. In fact, as I mentioned in my short comment and also mentioned in our written statement, actually the response to the from the management. Actually, we feel very comfortable because, as I mentioned, that the GEF 2020, when we come up with a strategy in 2014 for next few years, we already acknowledged that there are several influencing models which actually produce the so-called value addition, which basically means where GEF's additionality or niche comes from. And we actually come up with a kind of overlapped those 6 areas. And I don't think that I had a socio-economic thing in that 6 areas and the 6 influencing model we identified. But then the others, I think that are in. And I also, from our side, we picked up that the GEF's convening power. Or those kind of things as a part of the additionality or value addition of the GEF. So what I'm trying to say is that in the past and as of now, we have been kind of already operationalizing those 6 and where the additionality lens from day-to-day business. And the GEF 7 has very clearly recognized that those sources of the additionality in our operation and our results architecture also try to cover a lot of co-benefit coming from those additionality. So that's the reason we thought that we quite welcome it and we feel comfortable it, and it will be very helping that going forward the IEO continue to actually to strengthen the evaluation using those lenses. So that is another reason why that we very much support and welcome this evaluation. There is a suggestion that that is useful that if we could more formally or technically, concretely introduce those criteria into the evaluation, that the examination, the review of the project and process. And it's quite a difficult question to say, partly because that the PIF process is already very much complicated. We were under the strong pressure from the council, and there is the negotiation of the GEF7 to how to simplify PIF, how to simplify the indicator, how to simplify the research architecture, so that while that we are trying to really reduce the number of indicators, other research measurement, and trying to again expand, this really may not really help us much going forward. But the important thing is that when we come up with a PIF, or actually the PFD at this stage for the impact program, we have actually gone through those exercises where the additionality of those impact program comes from. And as yesterday I mentioned, that each of the actually 3 plus now to 5 IP, if you think about all 3 different biomes, each IP has its tailored, source of the additionality. So in a sense, we have already done this exercise and try to tailor those source of additionality to each of the impact program. I think that process has done, or will continue to do it, and that would be our response to how to make best use of this evaluation to our review of the project. So that and I think that our team will continue to strengthen that lens that while we are doing that reviewing, or to come up with any kind of PIF for IP and other important programs. So that will be maybe our response as of today. So that I hope that I respond to your inquiries. Thank you.
Thank you, Naoko. I think with all of this clarity being provided, I believe the council is in better position to take a decision now. I just want to kindly call on or invite the council members to adopt the decision as the draft decision provided. Okay then. Thank you. I think we have some luxury of time before lunch. We want to bring in one of the items deferred yesterday, which is a non-grant instrument, for us to look at it before go for lunch. If that is accepted by all, I just want to call the team. Just to. Okay, thank you, madam.
Thank you, Abdul. So I would like to invite Gustavo and the team to present to you a non-grant instrument. Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Naoko. Good morning. It's a pleasure to introduce to you the document pertaining to the GEF7 non-instruments program, we call the NGI. The GEF7 NGI program builds on the experience that we had with GEF6, which resulted in 11 very innovative projects that used $99.5 million of GEF funding and leveraged $1.792 billion, or 18 times the GEF investment. For GEF7, the replenishment established a window of 136 million for a new round of NGI investments. And for the implementation of the GEF7 program, we'll continue to use the existing policy for NGIs that the Council has approved. But the document in front of you just seeks to complement the existing policy by addressing elements that became part of the GEF7 programming strategies more directly. So specifically, we propose to strengthen the transparency in the implementation of the NGI program by applying more explicit financial criteria. We'll also formalize what we call the ad hoc group of financial experts that we have used in GEF 6 to assist us on the technical and financial review of proposals and to apply and refine the financial criteria, which are summarized actually in this document. This will help us to continue to fund non-grant instruments based on the principle of minimum concessionality. In GEF 7, we'll also address some market failures and barriers to private sector engagement, which have become apparent during the GEF 6 NGI pilot, which included the need to provide resource for aggregation. Some smaller projects do not have, and that they need these tools. We also need to strengthen the capacity of project developers, both on the deal structuring as well as on the results side, and to provide funding for pipeline management. We'll continue to fund projects with potential for systemic impact, as well as facilities that strengthen linkages between investors and project developers to provide seed capital, encourage project incubation and deal origination, particularly in frontier sectors such as marine plastics, sustainable agriculture, landscape management, blue carbon, and the sort. So this is a critical and very exciting moment to turn GEF 7 promise into practice, using our experience in GEF 6, and hopefully using this instrument to help tackle global environmental issues. The NGI program, of course, will help us engage much more actively with the private sector and try to catalyze capital and new market strength for sustainable development projects with the GEF. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you so much, Gustavo. So I'd like to open the floor for questions and comments. Peter, please.
Thank you, Naoko, and thank you, Gustavo, for a crisp presentation of a good, crisp paper, a good indication of the development of the programme. I want to take the floor first, actually, just given the emphasis that, as Australia, we'd put on the maintenance and indeed the development of the non-grant instrument programme in GEF 7 following, in our view, the very successful launch of the pilot programme during GEF 6, and the numbers on that speak for themselves. So acknowledging those achievements and welcoming the step forward, I think along with the development, the further strengthening of transparency is important and welcome, as is the utilisation of independent financial experts to complement the review processes, and that recognises the capacity constraints that were acknowledged in the GEF 7 replenishment discussions. To that, recognising the pressures on the administrative budget, nonetheless, we welcome the recruitment of an additional staff member with specific expertise in private sector and financial markets to aid the programme's development. A question really would be around the funding cap, and we welcome some more information on that. What would the cap be? How will projects demonstrate impact at scale? How will that be determined? And also, how will this impact risk concentration? And then really just the co-benefits, I guess, to probably misuse that phrase. I'm interested in how this work links with and helps progress the broader piece on private sector engagement and the development of the private sector engagement plan. And specifically, your reference to the financial experts group ceasing to be ad hoc and becoming a permanent fixture. To what extent is there any linkages there with the private sector advisory group? Is there a linkage that we could benefit from with that proposal? But again, thank you. Very welcome support for the direction that you're travelling in. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. May I call on Mata, followed by Apana?
Gracias, Presidente.
Thank you, Madam Chair. The Southern constituency has looked at this mechanism with interest that invites participation by the private sector in Latin America. These are projects with the Inter-American Development Bank. As focal points, we had no knowledge about this mechanism. And not only are we interested to see it as a mechanism now, but we also believe it's a tool that would complement other GEF projects. Nonetheless, we consider or would like to ask that, although we realize it is a relationship between the private banking, in this case IDB, with the GEF, and therefore there could be limitations as to the amount of information that can be obtained from countries or companies. This is something that the IDB told us about this morning at a meeting that we had with them as a constituency. We would like some more information about this and consider about another point in addition to the operational focal points if these projects occur in countries, and if possible, the constituency group would like to know if we could have a deeper presentation for Latin America as to this mechanism. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Martha. May I call on Apana, followed by Tobias?
Thank you, Nauko. We would like to welcome this paper, but also reiterate our understanding that GEF is primarily a grant-based organization, and we expect that grants will continue to be the preferred financial instrument. As regards the NGI program, we look forward to actually exploring how this can be leveraged to ensure private fund infusion through use of blended finance, as is being done in some of the other MDBs, and also whether you are looking at the use of guarantees through this mechanism, and what are the specific conditions for approval of guarantees. The second item on which we will require more information is that you have proposed that an appropriate concessional rate of return on investment will be negotiated. So we would like to understand actually who will be involved in this negotiation, whether it will be the role of the advisory group or the secretariat, and whether we understand, of course, the package or the proposal will come finally to the Council for approval, but how the negotiation will be conducted, because it involves a minimum level of concessionality that is to be decided on a case-by-case basis. So we are moving away from a rule-based application to a case-by-case. So it will be interesting to understand how the negotiations will be conducted. And finally, something on which we have been repeatedly stressing, I think it will be important to also have the OFPs clearly in the picture, because the use of private resources in some of these areas is quite sensitive, relating to biodiversity, dry lands, sustainable forest management, and it is necessary to reassure ourselves that the recipient government is comfortable with a robust policy and regulatory framework for ensuring the success of the private sector-led investment using the NGI instrument of GEF. So this is something on which I would like Secretariat to enlighten us on how we propose to integrate the role of the OFP in the process of approving the use of NGI in specific cases. Thank you.
Thank you so much. May I call on Tobias, followed by Yannick.
Thank you, Chair. From our side, we support the implementation framework, and we welcome the suggestion to present reflows from the NGI projects at the fall 2019 meeting. We would also like to see a presentation of the NGI projects from GEF 7 could include the amount of the funding from the GEF of all the projects, which are not, as far as we can see, in the current presentation. And we would also like to ask if any of the projects receive funding from the GEF 6 would also be able to receive funding from during the GEF 7 project cycle. Then also in relation to the comment from Australia, we would like to understand better the specific parameters to measure whether funding proposals have potential for demonstrating impact at scale, and in that way be able to receive funding exceeding the USD 15 million cap. And finally, with the aim to increase transparency, as was also mentioned during the presentation, we would like to see that the Council could receive information on how the criteria were used to select these projects, as well as information on the selection process. And from our side, we would like to suggest that this will also be presented at the fall 2019 meeting together with the reflows. Thank you.
Thank you. May I call on Yannick, followed by Marita.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Now, the Central Africa constituency countries are very interested in the development of the private sector, especially in areas that have to do with the environment. And we fully support the GEF 7 project that supports financial modalities other than grants. Now, we know that all of this is very complex in terms of the administration, but we would like to know what agencies are interested in the development of such projects. If Central Africa did not actually represent a critical mass of potential projects, we could envisage projects at continental scale or transversal projects such as forest restoration, sustainable management of biodiversity, and others. And I should like to mention tourism, where public-private partnerships are possible. The development of the private sector is important and a determinant factor, and it would be an opportunity for countries of the region to integrate another aspect that is important to the GEF, such as an inclusive approach with local communities and communities dependent on forests, the participation of vulnerable groups, the young and women. Thank you.
Thank you. May I call on Marita, followed by Matthew.
Thank you, Naoko. We support the draft decision and the strengthening of the private sector instrument. We think these changes will improve the efficiency in the mobilization of resources from the private sector. We can also support in exceptional cases larger innovative projects which have the potential to generate large-scale demonstration effects. We would like a clarification on the expected distribution of the investments between different focal areas, if possible, and impact programs. We would also like a bit more information on the approximate share of different types of financial instruments that are foreseen to be used. For example, how much will be guarantees, loans, equity, etc. I mean, because you're doing some of it through the MDBs. And what is the expected average leverage that you foresee? I also have another question like that. We would appreciate it very much if the Secretariat could provide a rough estimate of how much financial resources the program is foreseen to leverage over a 4-year period, and whether the program is foreseen to work together with similar programs in other climate funds or in MDBs. And finally, I have a question on the advisory group. I had understood that we decided already in June on the terms of reference, but just to be sure, I would like to mention again that we hope that the group will be gender balanced, including experts from both developed and developing countries, from both large, small and medium, and micro enterprises. I mean, to have a mix of companies. And I couldn't find this decision that we actually took this. I know we discussed this in June, but I'm not sure what the decision was. Thank you.
Thank you. May I call on Matthew, followed by Anna.
Thank you very much, and thank you for putting together this document. It is indeed interesting. I just wanted to make some more general comments about this area as we think about moving down this path and moving beyond sort of the GEF's traditional grant-only model. I think we certainly have some reservations that we want to be kept in mind as we go down that path. I mean, first, I'll just reiterate the point that Aparna made, that we certainly see this as a grant-based institution and very much want to keep the structure of GEF grant-based. Second, I think, as we consider the expansion of tools that increase the GEF's leverage, in particular the use of partial or full guarantees, we need to keep in mind that that can present financial risks to donors that are not readily apparent. And so I think that just requires an enhanced, rigorous oversight over how we use those and what that means for GEF's financial structure. Second, as we use equity and structured financing products in private sector projects, that certainly will require a clear focus on ensuring additionality as we do so. That you'll need to make that case even more so when you use these instruments and in those contexts than you normally would. And then just generally, I mean, I do think that this necessitates, a very clear focus on additionality overall. And so, as we do this more and move down this path, I mean, we'll want to understand clearly what are the metrics and the processes that you're using to assess the additionality of doing things like this that are beyond what the traditional model has been. Thank you.
Thank you so much. May I call on Anna, followed by Rachuna.
Thank you very much. We welcome this document and the direction that you're taking. As many of you know, Canada has been a strong proponent of the GEF building its capacity to deploy innovative finance, including non-grant instruments, as a complement to its grant instruments. We see NGIs as an important component in the GEF toolkit to be deployed when there are clear opportunities to crowd in funding and expertise and leverage additional global environmental benefits. We are pleased that the pilot from GEF 6 has become a full program, and we look forward to seeing what results come from the current project. We are also happy that the Secretariat is building its capacity to support blended finance transactions by hiring additional staff with expertise in this space and continuing to retain the advisory group. What we would like to see, however, is some more concrete information on how the Secretariat plans to alleviate the constraints highlighted in GEF 6, particularly as they relate to aggregating resources, providing capacity building and pipeline development, and enabling projects to tap into capital markets. You mentioned it in your presentation, but what we're really looking for is some more concrete information on how you're planning to deal with those issues. We'd also like to get some more information on the terms of the Financial Expert Advisory Group, the role of the new staff member within the Secretariat, and the process and/or criteria for how the NGI projects can receive an exception to the $15 million cap. And finally, we support the calls for an update on this issue in the fall of 2019. Thank you.
Thank you. May I call on Rachuna, followed by Stefan?
Thank you, Madam Chair. We understand the need for this innovative financing mechanism put forward by GEF, but we have to say that operational modality is still very much blurred. So we would like to have more information on what type of projects can be funded under this NGI, whether it is a pure private sector project or it can be a blend of public-private sector project. How will you launch the non-grant instrument? Will there be an expression of interest like you are doing for the impact programs for the sake of more transparency with more detailed eligibility criteria? And what will be the role of OFPs? Do we have to endorse these non-grant instrument projects funded under these non-grant instruments like that? So we would want to have more information on this.
Thank you. May I call on Stefan, followed by Carola?
Thank you, Madam Chair. We thank the Secretary for this document. We read it carefully, noted that in GEF 6, through 11 projects and roughly $100 million in GEF funding, 1.792 billions were mobilized. So that's a bigger ratio than for regular GEF projects and programs, but actually that is expected for when working with the private sector. In that regard, like some others, we would want to hear if there's any aspirational envisaged ratio for NGI mobilization ratios in GEF 7. The NGI under GEF 6 revealed several constraints related to market failures, which we tried to address in GEF 7. The document mentions some of them, including aggregating small investments. We very much understand that and very much support the idea of aggregating and bundling. Also, that in certain cases, the ceiling of 15 million may be a hindrance. So we're very much for flexibility, but we would like to hear a little bit more what kind of criteria would you apply. We note that it is planned to establish a group of financial experts. The document mentions elements of terms of reference for the group. We have a few questions in that respect. One is, how many experts will the group consist of? Who will select the members and what is the process? And then perhaps the few elements of terms of reference that are currently in the document are, in our view, not sufficient. We need more detail to get a full grasp of what exactly the task of this group is. We also note and welcome that the GEF SEC is in the process of recruiting an additional staff with expertise in the private sector and financial market. I guess that is a good investment to have an anchor person in the Secretariat exactly for these kind of activities. Final comments about reflows and about monitoring. If I'm right, the first reflows can be expected during GEF 7. Will they go back into the NGI pot or will they go elsewhere? And about the monitoring, the decision that was taken back then, excuse me, talks a lot about monitoring reflows and financial flows, but actually I'm at least as much interested in knowing how do we monitor the impacts, the positive environmental impacts, and there the document is rather scant unless I overlooked something. Thank you.
Thank you. May I call on Carola, followed by Laura.
Thank you very much, Naoko. We have agreed some measures in the GEF 7 replenishment process, and I think we now need to make a success of that agreement. And we feel it's important that the GEF 7 NGI program will continue to support facilities that strengthen and sustain linkages between investors and project developers, to provide seed capital, to encourage project incubation and deal origination in frontier sectors, and also, as others mentioned, support innovative financing methods. In this vein, we commend actually the information you provided, and we also welcome the involvement of independent financial experts to complement the standard review process by formalizing the existing ad hoc group of financial experts. So from our side, our full support for the proposed decision. Thank you.
Thank you so much. May I call on Laura, followed by Comlan.
Gracias, señora presidenta.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I want to thank the Secretariat for preparing this document. It is important to emphasize that that there is one of these projects for the region, and we are very interested in its objectives. They focus on the restoration and the comprehensive management of natural resources and all of the activities having to do with sustainable management so as to increase ecosystem services. Now, this is something that we have been working on with a view to landscape and giving greater value added to forest products and also forestry products. But we think it's important, as other constituencies have said, it's important that these projects be used as part of the national projects in the framework of GEF and within the framework of the GEF 7 portfolio. All of this has to do with the projects that will be part of the impact projects. It makes good sense to link this type of instrument if we're talking about increasing the resources and creating additionality and supporting sustainability. So that would make good sense. Consequently, it's very important that the operational focal points be able to have access to this information so that we can follow up on it. It would seem that agencies understand that these projects are private sector and they're not part of the GEF portfolio, which is a slight contradiction because it should be part of the GEF portfolio. Likewise, we would like to reiterate what other constituencies have said. We mustn't forget that the GEF is basically based on grants. And although these projects may not get resources from STAR directly, they do obtain GEF resources. So I think that better integration would allow us to coordinate the portfolio and focus on national objectives, because after all, these projects are also contributing to global indicators within the GEF's results framework. So we all have to be working towards that same objective. And consequently, this should create the possibility of joint reporting on results. And once again, here I'm thinking about GEF 7 and impact programs. Thank you.
May I call on Komlan and second time, right? Okay. All right, so the Komlan, you will be the last speaker.
Merci, madame.
Thank you. My constituency does see with interest this document, and we welcome it. And we would like to know, first of all, what preponderance we will give to the free interest of the GEF. We would like to think that the interventions are, in essence, for free. That is the first comment on the document. Then we would like to commend you for the disposition that were taken to reinforce capacities in the Secretariat as to recruiting specific staff and specialized staff in this domain. We would like to know, as to the operational focal points, what are the positions that will be made and so as to warrant the transfer of information nationally, because these focal points are in charge of knowing the topic and then bringing the information on these instruments to the actors, to the private sector nationally. After the capacity strengthening work that is being done at the Secretariat, what are the dispositions that were made so that the reinforcing of capacity, strengthening of capacity be made with the focal points? Thank you.
Thank you so much. I would like to invite Gustavo to respond all of your good questions.
Thank you, Naoka, and thanks for the questions and for the overall support to this continuation of this initiative. I'll try to respond in no particular order the questions that we got. Let me start with the question on rates of concessionality and how those discussions actually take place and who negotiates. So the practice has been that we rely quite heavily on the implementing agencies. The implementing agencies, of course, have qualified staff that are involved in these kinds of financial instruments on a regular basis to negotiate the rate. And in addition to that, through what we had before, which is this ad hoc group of financial experts, we would also review those rates against market signals and this type of project that comes from the impact investment world, and see if the concessional rates that were being proposed were on par with the current practice. Of course, the final decision rests with the Council. Once the project proposal gets recommended, those parameters will be reviewed by you. But the negotiation is actually done between the proponent agency and their respective experts with the filter from the Secretariat. And as you all have mentioned, we now have the happy addition of a financial expert, hopefully fairly soon. The recruitment process initiated a couple of months ago, and we are in the final stages of selecting that. And so we'll have another warm body with a good financial structuring capability to also help with that process. On the question of potential risks to donors, actually, we hope that is not the case, because the funding, any reflows, any returns on these investments actually do not flow back to donors. They actually go to the trustees. So it goes back to the GEF Trust Fund. So there's no real liability from the perspective of you as donors. This is almost like a grant, because it doesn't return to you. You're not making investments yourselves, but actually we are making investments or using this money for investments that return to the trust fund, and with potential to return to the trust fund. On the question of distribution across focal areas, as you've seen in the policy, we should fund projects on any eligible focal areas. But by practice, and many of you touched on the question of additionality and whether we are really employing the right methodologies to assess whether we're not subsidizing the private sector or putting money where other sources of commercial capital would be available to fill it. That question is very important. And over time, and as you can see in the portfolio of GEF 6, the field of renewable energy, for example, it's becoming quite difficult really to make a strong case that they need seed capital, equity investment, or any concessionality in terms of lending that we can provide, because that money is, for the most part, available in the commercial market with good rates of return. So we can't build really the additionality case for most of these projects. I wouldn't say that this is the case everywhere. There are underserved regions. We had one project that actually did not make part of the GEF 6 cycle. It was a prior one in GEF 5 with the Inter-American Development Bank that looked at post-recovery investments in renewable energy in the Caribbean, particularly for off-grid solutions, and that that proposal lacked capital that could de-risk investments coming from potential investors. So that was a good example of where the renewable energy sector was still a viable intervention from the perspective of these financial instruments. I think there was a question about how we intend to use the different instruments. That's a question that we can't really a priori respond because it depends a lot on the deals. I would just say that loans are probably the least preferred, I would say, modality that we would use or instrument that we would use. We're not really a bank, and we're not really equipped to moving large amounts of money with that purpose, even though we have, in a couple of cases, used it because it was the most appropriate instrument. Equity has been particularly sought after, guarantees, and taking first loss positions or subordinate positions into deals that have a potential to generate significant impacts on the result side have been quite attractive. So we'll have to see on a deal-by-deal basis. The question, what we also experienced with the GEF 6 window or pilot was that probably the biggest need is really to develop a strong pipeline of projects. There's no real, at the end of the day, lack of capital available from, particularly on the impact investment side, which is primarily, our second set of clients in addition to commercial investors. And we also the aggregation piece was an important one because I think we need also in certain places, in certain geographies, to be able to attract larger investors, and they won't really be interested in dealing with small investments because they don't not equipped to dealing with examining risk return profiles for individual projects. You really have to create bigger investment packages that they don't need to understand fully, but rather have confidence in. We also started piloting creation and working with market operators to develop new asset classes on natural resource management in general. So the so-called CIPIC, the Coalition for Investment, Private Investment in Conservation, is developing a series of blueprints that serve both for deal structuring from the financial side as well as for the results side. We got a question, I forgot who did it, about how we monitor the results. Actually, this is probably one of the most important challenges is actually tracking the results, and we have rejected projects which couldn't really demonstrate on the offset that they would be generating global environmental benefits as we have it in terms of our indicators. Even though they had the potential to do it, they couldn't really articulate how that would be delivered, and those investments were not approved on our side, even though the financial side would be appealing. On the cap, the $15 million cap, that's a provision just to ask for a certain flexibility in cases that we've experienced in the GEF 6 cycle, in which if we had more money, we could perhaps have had a disproportionate impact going a little higher. So we're not, and at the end of the day, we're not going to be bringing to you for approval projects that will take, a significant share of the entire allocation, but it's just to give us a little bit of room so that if we have to go a little above the $15 million cap, we would be able to work with the agencies and the proponents to actually explore those options. So that's the idea there. On the advisory group, in GEF 6, we employed, not paid employed, we used financial experts that have, quite a lot of experience in this market, some of them dealing both with the capital market as well as the impact investment side of the business, to advise us on individual project proposals. They would screen through the proposals after the agencies have submitted it to us, and they would give their honest opinion. They don't have any interest in that, in the outcome of those projects. They're doing, frankly, this on on a voluntary basis and using their skills because they can do that. They are in a position to do that, and they are available to do that. And they are close to us. And so that's the other constraint. The private sector advisory group, what we call PSAG, PSAG, that will come to you for approval in the next council meeting. That group serves a different function in the GEF 7 replenishment process. They are primarily used to bring big private sector players or private sector players that can open up space or can transmit opportunities that exist out there to make the GEF money, particularly the GEF grant money on impact programs, for example, to be better used and to get more impact and scale. This particular function that we are trying to let's say, bring some more structure to it is entirely dedicated to helping us with the deal structuring side of these deals, and therefore they cannot be residing, in different places. It's not really conducive of having something that's not very close to the Secretariat in terms of physically and availability of time, and also their ability to give their time on a pro bono basis to do this work. So that's the intent that we have, to continue using that function, which has proven very effectively to the outcomes of the program, and they had significant influence at the end of the day in how eventually, we decided to move forward with projects or not. Let me see. OFPs, thanks for the question. As you know, it's very clear stated in the document, we don't need endorsements from OFPs to move with these projects. And actually, that provision is intended to allow these deals to go forward, because the private sector moves and these investors move on a very different pace under very different sets of conditions than our regular grant-based projects do. And to create that kind of let's say, choke point to the development of such projects would not be conducive, and investors would quickly fly. What we will do is to make sure that we inform if activity is going to be done in one or more countries, that those projects, once they have been approved and are under preparation, that the OFPs understand that that's the case, and have the ability to explore what else they can do. Well, I mean, this is okay. I got a note here, which I think it's superfluous, but when we operate with loans with governments, but we're not operating with loans in government. We would, of course, have to have the approval of the national government, but that's not the case for the investments here. Did I miss anything, Naoko?
Maybe I will take this expected leverage.
Okay. You can take that.
Yeah, one question which I was really intrigued is a expected leverage, that how much you expect from this 135 million window. The history of the GEF 6 is 1 to 18. Is that right? Yes. So it's a very high leverage. And of course, easy answer is that, yeah, we would like to expect at least the same or it's more. But I must not necessarily say that. It quite depends on what kind of things you would like to have for next 4 years utilizing this window. And I see actually there are two things we would like to see, or we'd like to explore. As Gustavo mentioned, that we should be moving toward much more additionality, or that we should do something that other same kind of blended finance mechanisms may not do. Again, at Katowice, I attended this green financing high-level gathering, and then the entire conversation is actually about, even if they said green financing, it's actually the renewable energy and energy efficiency. There is a very little conversation about agroforestry or coastal fishery or other part of this natural resource management. So that I would like to say that we want to continue to focus on those new and maybe more risky areas, but maybe that really fits to our mandate. And then in those areas, they requires a kind of public resources too. That doesn't necessarily mean, so that we can't really expect a very, very high leverage from capital market, but let us see that how those potential intervention may give us. So that's one. Second thing is that actually, even if that we put this new name, non-grant instrument, for GEF 6, in fact, we have been doing this quite some time. And we are very proud of that our projects, which produced a quite high leverage in the past. But we always find that it's so strange that why these kind of things will not be replicated, or why we cannot achieve scale. We were always talking about the same kind of thing and size. Why is that? What is these barriers? And as Gustav mentioned, I think it's really good time for us to try that how we could overcome those barriers of the capacity, its aggregation, and then and also some kind of sunk cost, and how to do that in project preparation. And so there are a few things that we would like to address. And then, as also mentioned, this a platform approach may be the most useful or effective one to address those constraints all together. So that we actually did request in this paper that if we could do more like those kind of platform approach, which is kind of different from just a deal by deal approach. It's more like we would like to do together with a foundation and those institutional investors to create this platform so that we can all together address those constraints. That's what we actually meant in this paper. So that if we go for that approach, again, that the leverage may not be easily calculated, but I think it's really a good way for us to explore the additionality. So with those two things, that we are not necessarily saying that we want to repeat the same kind of high leverage of 1 to 20, but I think that we should continue to explore that, that additionality. That would be my proposal. I saw that Marita raised the flag. Did I invite more questions? Maybe Apana raised the flag. So Marita, do you want to come in?
Thank you, Gustavo and Naoko. I just wanted to come back on a couple of points. The first one on the advisory group. I remember the discussion we had in June, and several council members were quite clear about what kind of criteria they wanted to guide the selection of the experts. And it would be good if you could inform us what type of experts you will have in the group, if you are really following up on that discussion we had in June. Secondly, I think when it comes to financial instruments, I mean, we are fully aware of that the GEF is a grant-based organization, but it's the question of what we can do to leverage resources. And I think we would like to see an innovative use of instruments, and I agree, loans is maybe not the most innovative, but I mean, how can we use these instruments to leverage the most? Thank you.
Apana?
Thank you for some of the clarifications. I would just like to understand regarding the response given by Gustavo on the role of the OFP. Certainly, my intention was not that the OFP should be like a choke point or a bottleneck. My concern only is about the policy or regulatory environment. So, for example, there was a suggestion about the high potential for private sector investment in tourism, right? So, I think if we talk about providing some equity or debt for a tourism industry to come up in a biodiversity area, as GEF, we would be looking at something that is sustainable tourism. That is the model we will be looking at. So there may be certain policy framework or even statutory framework in place. So I just would like to understand, when we negotiate that project, how are we proposing to make sure that we are aligned with the public policy or the statutory framework. So that due diligence, will we do it ourselves as GEF Secretariat, or would we require some kind of validation or cooperation from the OFP? That was the limited point. So I am also saying this from my own experiences regarding sometimes there is unfettered developments of private sector tourism very close to sanctuaries and biodiversity areas, and then later we find that the policy was not followed or it was not strong enough. So that responsibility, do you want to take it yourself on the Secretariat? Because certainly I don't know whether the private sector advisory group will be competent. How will we do that? That is what I would like to understand.
Okay, is that Peter?
Sorry, I will also like to second the point raised by Marita regarding the composition. It should be somewhere, I think, documented how we are going to, what will be the compensation, the balance between advanced economies, developing economies, small SMEs, large multinationals, and also the process that you will be following to bring the names to the council. It may be useful to have it documented somewhere rather than leaving it to our memories. Yeah.
Peter?
Thank you, and apologies for coming back a second time, but I thought just to moderate perhaps any perceptions of a red-hot rush on the part of Australia to jump into risky business, to use a market term. I think very reassured by the responses to the questions from all participants in this discussion. This is new ground to a large extent. It's untested to a large extent. And I think the measure of caution that we get from your responses is reassuring. I think on issues like application of concessionality and risk appetite, these things need to be very carefully analysed. It's not about maximising reflows. It's about additionality. It's about environmental benefits. It's about smart placing of investments, crowding in private sector, etc. So I encourage you to continue along those lines, not be driven necessarily by a metric. We will get a return at some point and we'll find out what it is, but let's not be driven by a sort of light on the hill necessarily. I also just want to say I'm more clear now on the distinction between the private sector advisory group and the ad hoc expert group. I think one is more transactional and the other is more facilitative, and that's a clear distinction for me. One last question, then really stop. I presume there's close consultation with neighbours around here in the IFC, who of course have done a great deal of work and continue to on concessionality and DFIs and risk appetites and such like. So if not a formal part of the advisory group, I think would be keen to be reassured that you're in consulting the IFC on many of these questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So let me respond to a few questions, and I'd like to ask Gustavo to follow up. About this confusion you have also mentioned about the PSAG, Private Sector Advisory Group, and this formalization of expert group, that these are two different groups. And yes, that we discuss a lot, and we agree that what would be the composition of this PSAC, Private Sector Advisory Group, which we agree on that, diversity of the gender and region and the north to south and also sectors, and that remains as it is, and we were actually working on it and quite hard. So that's one. And this group is very different. That, as you may recall, that we used to have, and we still do have, this informal experts group to help us assess that those proposals. And what we agreed, actually, that also at the conclusion of the negotiation is that we will formalize that group and with clearer TOR and responsibility. And then that we would like to also to take a look at the composition one more time. Why? Because there is a very strong interest from the discussion table that what would be the best way to minimize the risk of inadvertently subsidizing the private sector. And this is one way to address that concern. And that's why that we put it very clearly on the table. So I just want to make sure that you can take OFP question.
Just responding to Aparna's question. Aparna, you are absolutely 100% correct. The analysis of what's the policy and legal framework at the country level, if the investments are going to be made in that environment, is one of the key questions that actually all investors are going to be addressing. Because if there is any disconnect, of course, you are risking your investment. So that's really a central question and a central part of the scrutiny that's done both by the agency that's operating on our behalf, by the Secretariat when it does its review, but those that are advising us, and eventually by yourselves, because these projects come back to you. And we'll continue with the practice of informing the OFPs as these projects come along, and hopefully if there is another reason to be concerned, we'll get on to that. And to your point, it's not only necessarily the OFP, because sometimes the OFP sits in the environmental ministry as opposed to the finance minister, as opposed to the planning minister. So we try to inform all those different players. Just one final point about capacity. If you recall, we had a dedicated staff before David Rogers, who retired. That position was filled by a person from the Inter-American Development Bank, from the private arm of the Inter-American Development Bank, who with a lot of experience in the capital market before he came, Filippo Berardi, who's sitting right behind there. So he just joined us a couple of months ago, and he also brings a lot of expertise in addition to the new position that we come to bear. So we're very happy that that's strengthening the capacity of the Secretariat. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the very active discussion. With this, and I would like to propose a proposed decision to be adopted. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Naoko. So 3 quick announcements. 1, somebody lost a pair of glasses yesterday, that side of the room. Pick it up, please, if it's yours. Secondly, the timing for the usual photograph is now, so I think the easiest is for the council members and alternates to come forward, stand behind the chair and vice chair, and we'll take the photo then. Then we have lunch in the atrium, and we'll try to be back by 2:30, please. So I invite the council members and alternates to come forward for the photograph.